Chapter 8 of Romulus. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Simon Wainwright. Romulus by Jacob Abbott. Chapter 8. The Twins. BC 774 through 755. Although the temple of Vesta itself at Alba Longa was the principal scene of the duties which developed upon the Vestal Virgins, still they were not wholly confined in their avocations to that sacred edifice, but were often called upon, one or two at a time, to perform services or to assist in the celebration of rites at other places in the city and vicinity. There was a temple consecrated to Mars near Alba. It was situated in the opening of the woods in some little glen or valley at the base of the mountain. There was a stream of water running through the ground, and Rhea, in the performance of her duties as a Vestal, was required at one time to pass to and fro through the grooves in this solitary place to fetch water. Here she allowed herself, in violation of her Vestal vows, to form the acquaintance of a man, whom she met in the groves. She knew well that by doing so she made herself subject to the most dreadful penalties in case her fault should become known. Still she yielded to the temptation, and allowed herself to be persuaded to remain with the stranger. She said afterward, when the facts were brought to light, that her meeting with this companion was wholly unintentional on her part. She saw a wolf in the grove, she said, and she ran terrified into a cave to escape from him, and that the man came to her there to protect her, and then compelled her to remain with him. Besides, from his dress and countenance and air, she had believed him, she said, to be the god Mars himself, and thought that it was not her duty to resist his will. However this may be, her stolen interview or interviews with this stranger were not known at the time, and Rhea perhaps thought that her fault would never be discovered. Some weeks after this, however, it was observed by her companions and friends that she began to appear thoughtful and depressed. Her dejection increased day by day. Her face became wan and pale, and her eyes were often filled with tears. They asked her what was the cause of her trouble. She said she was sick. She was soon afterward excused from her duties in the Vestal temple, and went away and remained for some time shut up in retirement and seclusion. There at length two children, twins, were born to her. It was thought through the influence of Antho, Rhea's cousin, that the unhappy Vestal was not put to death by Amulius before her children were born, at the time when her fault was first discovered. The laws of the state in respect of Vestal virgins, which were inexorably severe, would have justified him in causing her to be executed at once. But Antho interceded so earnestly for her unhappy cousin that Amulius for a time spared her life. When, however, her sons were born, the anger of Amulius broke out anew. If she had remained childless, he would have probably allowed her to live, though she could, of course, never be restored to her office in the temple of Vesta, or if she had given birth to a daughter, she might have been pardoned, since a daughter, on account of her sex, would have been little likely to disturb Amulius in the possession of the kingdom. But the existence of two sons, born directly in the line of the succession, and each of them having claims superior to his own, endangered most eminently he perceived his possession of power. He was, of course, greatly enraged. He caused Rhea to be shut up in close imprisonment, and as for the boys, he ordered them to be thrown into the Tiber. The Tiber was at some considerable distance from Alba, but it was probably near the place where Rhea had resided in her retirement, and where the children were born. A peasant of that region was entrusted with the task of throwing the children into the river. Whether his official duty in undertaking this commission required him actually to drown the boys, or whether he was allowed to give the helpless babes some little chance for their lives, is not known. At all events, he determined that in committing the children to the stream, he would so arrange it that they should float away from his sight, in order that he might not himself be a witness of their dying struggles and cries. He accordingly put them upon a species of float that he made, a sort of box or trough, as would seem from the ancient descriptions, which he had hollowed out from a log, and disposing their little limbs carefully within this narrow receptacle, he pushed the frail boat, with its navigators still more frail, out upon the current of the river. The name of the peasant who performed this task was Faustulus. The peasant also who subsequently, as will hereafter appear, found and took charge of the children, is spoken of by the ancient historians as Faustulus too. In fact, we might well suppose that no man, however rustic and rude, could give his time and his thoughts to two such babes long enough to make an ark for them, for the purpose of making it possible to save their lives, and then place them carefully in it, to send them away without becoming so far interested in their fate, and so touched by their mute and confiding helplessness, as to feel prompted to follow the stream to see how so perilous a navigation would end. We have, however, no direct evidence that Faustulus did so. Watch the progress of his boat down the river. The story is that it was drifted along, now whirling in eddies and now shooting down over rapids, currents, until at last, at a bend in the river, it was thrown upon the beach, and being turned over by the concussion, the children were rolled out upon the sand. The neighboring thickets soon, of course, resounded with their plaintive cries. A mother wolf, who was sleeping there, came out to see what was the matter. Now, a mother of whatever race is irresistibly drawn by an instinct, if incapable of a sentiment of affection, to love and to cherish anything that is newly born. The wolf caressed the helpless babes, imagining perhaps that they were her own offspring, and lying down by their side, she cherished and fed them, watching all the time with a fierce and vigilant eye for any approaching enemy or danger. The rude nursery might very naturally be supposed to be in dangerous proximity to the water. But it happened that the river, when the babes were set adrift in it, was very high, from the effect of rains upon the mountains. And thus, soon after the children were thrown upon the land, the water began to subside. In a short time it wholly returned to its accustomed channel, leaving the children on the warm sand, high above all danger. The wolf was not their only guardian. A woodpecker, the tradition says, watched over them too, and brought them berries and other sylvan food. The reader will perhaps be disposed to hesitate a little in receiving this last statement for sober history, but as no part of the whole narrative will bear any very rigid scrutiny, we may as well take the story of the woodpecker along with the rest. In a short time the children were rescued from their exposed situation by a shepherd, who is called Faustulus, and may or may not have been the same with the Faustulus by whom they had been exposed. Faustulus carried the children to his hut, and there the maternal attentions of the wolf and the woodpecker were replaced by those of the shepherd's wife. Her name was Laurentia. Faustulus was one of Amulius's herdsmen, having the care of the flocks and herds that grazed on this part of the royal domain, but living like any other shepherd in great seclusion in his hut in the forests. He not only rescued the children, but he brought home and preserved the trough in which they had been floated down the river. He put this relic aside, thinking that the day might perhaps come in which there would be occasion to produce it. He told the story of the children only to a very few trustworthy friends, and he accompanied the communication in the cases where he made it with many injunctions of secrecy. He named the foundlings Romulus and Remus, and as they grew up they passed generally for the shepherd's sons. Faustulus felt a great degree of interest and a high sense of responsibility, too, in having these young princes under his care. He took great pains to protect them from all possible harm, and to instruct them in everything which it was in those days considered important for young men to know. It is even said that he sent them to a town in Latium where there was some sort of seminary of learning, that their minds might receive a proper intellectual culture. As they grew up they were both handsome in form and in countenance, and were characterized by a graceful dignity of air and demeanor, which made them very attractive in the eyes of all who beheld them. They were prominent among the young herdsmen and hunters of the forest for their courage, their activity, their strength, their various personal accomplishments, and their high and generous qualities of mind. Romulus was more silent and thoughtful than his brother, and seemed to possess in some respects superior mental powers. Both were regarded by all who knew them with feeling of the highest respect and consideration. Romulus and Remus treated their own companions and equals, that is, the young shepherds and herdsmen of the mountain, with great courtesy and kindness, and were very kindly regarded by them in return. They, however, evinced a great degree of independence of spirit in respect to the various bailiffs and chief herdsmen and other officers of field and forest police, who exercised authority in the region where they lived. These men were sometimes haughty and domineering, and the peasantry in general stood greatly in awe of them. Romulus and Remus, however, always faced them without fear, never seeming to be alarmed at their threats or at any other exhibitions of their anger. In fact, the boys seemed to be imbued with a native loftiness and fearlessness of character, as if they had inherited a spirit of confidence and courage with their royal blood, or had imbibed a portion of the indomitable temper of their fierce forest mother. They were generous, however, as well as brave. They took the part of the weak and the oppressed against the tyrannical and the strong in the rustic contentions that they witnessed. They interposed to help the feeble, to relieve those who were in want, and to protect the defenseless. They hunted wild beasts, they fought against robbers, they rescued and saved the lost. For amusements they practiced running, wrestling, racing, throwing javelins and spears, and other athletic feats, and accomplishments in everything excelling all their competitors, and becoming in the end greatly renowned. Numitor, the father of Rhea Silvia, whom Amulius had dethroned and banished from Alba, was all this time still living, and he had now at length become so far reconciled to Amulius as to be allowed to reside in Alba, though he lived there as a private citizen. He owned, it seems, some estates near the Tiber, where he had flocks and herds that were tended by his shepherds and herdsmen. It happened at one time that some contention arose between the herdsmen of Numitor and those of Amulius, among whom Romulus and Remus were residing. Now, as the young men had thus far, of course, no idea whatever of their relationship to Numitor, there was no reason why they should feel any special interest in his affairs, and they, accordingly, as might naturally have been expected, took part with Amulius in this quarrel. Since Faustulus and all the shepherds around them were on that side, the herdsmen of Numitor, in the course of the quarrel, drove away some of the cattle which were claimed as belonging to the herdsmen of Amulius. Romulus and Remus, which they hastily called together to pursue the depredators and bring the cattle back. They succeeded in this expedition and recaptured the herd. This incensed the party of Numitor, and they determined on revenge. They waited some time for a favorable opportunity. At length the time came for celebrating a certain festival called the Supercalia, which consisted of very rude games and ceremonies, in which men sacrificed goats, and then dressed themselves partially in the skins, and ran about, wiping every one whom they met with thongs made likewise of the skins of goats, or of rabbits, or other animals remarkable for their fecundity. The meaning of the ceremonies, so far as such uncouth and absurd ceremonies could have any meaning, was to honor the god of fertility and fruitfulness, and to promote the fruitfulness of their flocks and herds during the year ensuing at the time that the celebrations were held. The retainers and partisans of Numitor determined on availing themselves of this opportunity to accomplish their object. Accordingly, they armed themselves, and coming suddenly upon the spot where the shepherds of Amulius were celebrating the games, they made a rush for Remus, who was at that time, in accordance with the custom, running to and fro, half naked, and armed only with goatskin thongs. They succeeded in making him prisoner, and bore him away in triumph to Numitor. Of course this daring act produced great excitement throughout the country. Numitor was well pleased with the prize that he had secured, but felt at the same time some fear of the responsibility which he incurred by holding the prisoner. He was strongly inclined to proceed against Remus and punish him himself for the offences which the herdsmen of his lands charged against him, but he finally concluded that this would not be safe, and he determined in the end to refer the case to Amulius for decision. He accordingly sent Remus to Amulius, making grievous charges against him as a lawless desperado, who, with his brother Numitor said, were the terror of the forest through their domineering temper and their acts of robbery and rapine. The king, pleased perhaps with the spirit of deference to his regal authority on the part of his brother, implied in the referring of the case of the accused to him for trial, sent Remus back again to Numitor, saying that Numitor might punish the freebooter himself in any way that he thought best. Remus was accordingly brought again to Numitor's house. In the meantime, the fact of his being thus made a prisoner and charged with crime, and the proceedings in relation to him in sending him back and forth between Amulius and Numitor, strongly attracted public attention. Every one was talking of the prisoner and discussing the question of his probable fate. The general interest which was thus awakened in respect to him and to his brother Romulus revived the slumbering recollections in the minds of the old neighbors of Faustulus, of the stories which he had told them of his having found the twins on the bank of the river in their infancy. They told this story to Romulus, and he or some other friends made it known to Remus while he was still confined. When Remus was brought before Numitor, who was really his grandfather, though the fact of this relationship was wholly unknown to both of them, Numitor was exceedingly struck with his handsome countenance and form, and with his fearless and noble demeanor. The young prisoner seemed perfectly self-possessed and at his ease, and though he knew well that his life was at stake, there was a certain air of calmness and composure in his manner, which seemed to denote very lofty qualities both of person and mind. A vague recollection of the lost children of his daughter Rhea immediately flashed across Numitor's mind. It changed all his anger against Remus to a feeling of wondering interest and curiosity, and gave to his countenance as he looked upon his prisoner an expression of kind and tender regard. After a short pause, Numitor addressed the young captive, speaking in a gentle, conciliating manner, and asked him who he was and who his parents were. "I will frankly tell you all that I know," said Remus, "since you treat me in so fair and honorable a manner. The king delivered me up to be punished without listening to what I had to say, but you seem willing to hear before you condemn. My name is Remus, and I have a twin brother named Romulus. We have always supposed ourselves to be the children of Faustulus, but now, since this difficulty has occurred, we have heard new tidings in respect to our origin. We are told that we were found in our infancy on the shore of the river at the place where Faustulus lives, and that near by there was a box or trough in which we had been floated down to the spot from a place above. When Faustulus found us, there was a wolf and a woodpecker taking care of us and bringing us food. Faustulus carried us to his house and brought us up as his children. He preserved the trough, too, and has it now. Numitor was, of course, greatly excited at hearing this intelligence. He perceived at once that the finding of these children, both in respect to time and place, and to all the attendant circumstances, corresponded so precisely with the exposure of the children of Rhea Silvia as to leave no reasonable ground for doubt that Romulus and Remus were his grandsons. He resolved immediately to communicate this joyful discovery to his daughter, if he could contrive the means of gaining access to her, for during all this time she had been kept in close confinement in her prison. In the meantime, Romulus himself, at the house of Faustulus in the forest, had become greatly excited by the circumstances in which he found himself placed. He had been very much incensed at the capture of Remus, and while concerting with Faustulus plans for rescuing him, Faustulus had explained to him the mystery of his birth. He had informed him not only how he was found with his brother by the bank of the river, but also had made known to him whose sons he and Remus were. Romulus was, of course, extremely elated at this intelligence. His native courage and energy were quickened anew by his learning that he and his brother were princes, and, as he believed, rightfully entitled to the throne. He immediately began to form plans for raising a rebellion against the government of Amulius, with a view of first rescuing Remus from his power, and afterward taking such ulterior steps as circumstances might require. Faustulus, on the other hand, leaving Romulus to raise the forces for his insurrection as he pleased, determined to go himself to Numitor and reveal the secret of the birth of Romulus and Remus to him. In order to confirm and corroborate his story, he took the trough with him, carrying it under his cloak, in order to conceal it from view, and in this manner made his appearance at the gates of Alba. There was something in his appearance and manner when he arrived at the gate which attracted the attention of the officers on guard there. He wore the dress of a countryman, and had obviously come in from the forest a long way, and there was something in his air which denoted hurry and agitation. The soldiers asked him what he had under his cloak, and compelled him to produce the ark to view. The curiosity of the guardsmen was still more strongly aroused, and seeing this old relic, it was bound with brass bands, and it had some rude inscription marked upon it. It happened that one of the guard was an old soldier who had been in some way connected with the exposure of the children of Rhea when they were set adrift in the river, and he immediately recognized this trough as the float which they had been placed in. He immediately concluded that some very extraordinary movement was going on, and he determined to proceed forthwith and inform Amulius of what he had discovered. He accordingly went to the king and informed him that a man had been intercepted at the gate of the city, who was attempting to bring in, concealed under his cloak, the identical ark or float which, to his certain knowledge, had been used in the case of the children of Rhea Silvia, for sending them adrift on the waters of the Tiber. The king was greatly excited and agitated at receiving this intelligence. He ordered Faustulus to be brought into his presence. Faustulus was much terrified at receiving this summons. He had but little time to reflect what to say, and during the few minutes that elapsed while they were conducting him into the presence of the king, he found it hard to determine how much it would be best for him to admit and how much to deny. Finally, in answer to the interrogations of the king, he acknowledged that he found the children and the ark in which they had been drifted upon the shore, and that he had saved the boys alive, and had brought them up as his children. He said, however, that he did not know where they were. They had gone away, he alleged, some years before, and were now living as shepherds in some distant part of the country. He did not know exactly where. Amulius then asked Faustulus what he had been intending to do with the trough which he was bringing so secretly into the city. Faustulus said that he was going to carry it to Rhea in her prison, she having often expressed a strong desire to see it as a token or memorial which would recall the dear babes that had lain in it very vividly to her mind. Amulius seemed satisfied that these statements were honest and true, but they awakened in his mind a very great solicitude and anxiety. He feared that the children, being still alive, might some day come to the knowledge of their origin, and so disturb his possession of the throne, and perhaps revenge by some dreadful retaliation the wrongs and injuries which he had inflicted upon their mother and their grandfather. The people, he feared, would be very much inclined to take part with them, and not with him, in any contest which might arise, for their sympathies were already on the side of Numitor. In a word, he was greatly alarmed, and he was much at a loss to know what to do to avert the danger which was impending over him. He concluded to send to Numitor and inquire of him whether he was aware that the boys were still alive, and if so, if he knew where they were to be found. He accordingly sent a messenger to his brother, commissioned to make these inquiries. This messenger, though in the service of Amulius, was really a friend to Numitor, and on being admitted to Numitor's presence, when he went to make the inquiries as directed by the king, he found Remus there, though not as he had expected, in the attitude of a prisoner awaiting sentence from a judge, but rather in that of a son in affectionate consultation with his father. He soon learned the truth, and immediately expressed his determination to espouse the cause of the prince. "The whole city will be on your side," said he to Remus. "You have only to place yourself at the head of the population and proclaim your rights, and you will easily be restored to the possession of them." Just at this crisis a tumult was heard at the gates of the city. Romulus had arrived there at the head of a band of peasants and herdsmen that he had collected in the forest. These insurgents were rudely armed, and were organized in a very simple and primitive manner. For weapons the peasants bore such implements of agriculture as could be used for weapons, while the huntsmen brought their pikes and spears and javelins, and such other projectiles as were employed in those days in hunting wild beasts. The troop was divided into companies of 100, and for banners they bore tufts of green on wisps of straw or fern or other herbage, tied at the top of a pole. The armament was rude, but the men were resolute and determined, and they made their appearance at the gates of the city upon the outside just in time to cooperate with Remus in the rebellion which he had raised within. The revolt was successful. A revolt is generally successful against a despot when the great mass of the population desire his downfall. Amulius made a desperate attempt to stem the torrent, but his hour had come. His palace was stormed and he was slain. The revolution was complete, and Romulus and Remus were masters of the country. End of chapter 8. Recording by Simon Wainwright.
Chapter 9 of Romulus. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by hearhis.com. Romulus by Jacob Abbott. Chapter 9. The Founding of Rome. B.C. 754. As soon as the excitement and the agitations which attended the sudden revolution by which Romulus was dethroned were in some measure calmed, and tranquillity was restored, the question of the mode in which the new government should be settled arose. Numitor considered it best that he should call an assembly of the people and lay the subject before them. There was a very large portion of the population who yet knew nothing certain in respect to the causes of the extraordinary events that had occurred. The city was filled with strange rumors, in all of which truth and falsehood were inextricably mingled, so that they increased rather than allayed the general curiosity and wonder. Numitor accordingly convened a general assembly of all the inhabitants of Alba in a public square. The rude and rustic mountaineers and peasants whom Romulus had brought to the city came with the rest. Romulus and Remus themselves did not at first appear. Numitor, when the audience was assembled, came forward to address them. He gave them a recital of all the events connected with the usurpation of Romulus. He told them of the original division which had been made 30 or 40 years before, of the kingdom and the estates of his father, between Romulus and himself, of the plans and intrigues by which Romulus had contrived to possess himself of the kingdom and reduce him, Numitor, into subjection to his sway, of his causing Aegisthus, Numitor's son, to be slain in the hunting party, and then compelling his little daughter Rhea to become a vestal virgin in order that she might never be married, and then went on to describe the birth of Romulus and Remus, the anger of Romulus when informed of the event, his cruel treatment of the children and of the mother, and his orders that the babes should be drowned in the Tiber. He gave an account of the manner in which the infants had been put into the little wooden ark, of their floating down the stream, and finally landing on the bank, and of their being rescued, protected, and fed by the wolf and the woodpecker. He closed his speech by saying that the young princes were still alive, and that they were then at hand ready to present themselves before the assembly. As he said these words, Romulus and Remus came forward, and the vast assembly, after gazing for a moment in silent wonder upon their tall and graceful forms, in which they saw combined athletic strength and vigor with manly beauty, they burst into long and loud acclamations. As soon as the applause had in some measure subsided, Romulus and Remus turned to their grandfather and hailed him king. The people responded to this announcement with new plaudits, and Numitor was universally recognized as the rightful sovereign. It seems that notwithstanding the personal graces and accomplishments of Romulus and Remus, and that popularity among their fellow foresters, and they and their followers made a somewhat rude and wild appearance in the city, and Numitor was very willing, when the state of things had become somewhat settled, that his rustic auxiliaries should find some occasion for withdrawing from the capital and returning again to their own native fastness. Romulus and Remus, however, having now learned that they were entitled to the regal name, naturally felt desirous of possessing a little regal power, and thus desired to remain in the city, while still they had to do much consideration for their grandfather to wish to deprive him of the government. After some deliberation, a plan was devised which promised to gratify the wishes of all. The plan was this, namely, that Numitor should set apart a palace in his kingdom of Latium, where Romulus and Remus might build a city for themselves, taking with them to the spot the whole horde of their retainers. The place which he designated for this purpose was the spot on the banks of the Tiber, where the two children had been landed upon floating down the stream. It was a wild and romantic region, and the enterprise of building a city upon it was one exactly suited to engage the attention and occupy the powers of such restless spirits as those who had collected under the young prince's standard. Many of these men, it is true, were shepherds and herdsmen, well disposed in mind, though rude and rough in manners. But then there were many others of a very turbulent and unmanageable character, outlaws, fugitives, and adventurers of every description, who had fled to the woods to escape punishment for former crimes, or seek opportunities for the commission of new deeds of rapine and robbery, and who had seized upon the occasion furnished by the insurrection against Romulus to come forth into the world again. Criminals always flock into armies when armies are raised, for war presents to the wicked and depraved all the charms, with but half the danger, of a life of crime. War is in fact ordinarily only a legal organization of crime. Romulus and Remus entered into their grandfather's plan with great readiness. Numitor promised to aid them in their enterprise by every means in his power. He was to furnish tools and implements for excavations and building, and artisans so far as artisans were required, and was also to provide such temporary supplies of provisions and stores as might be required at the outset of the undertaking. He gave permission also to any of his subjects to join Romulus and Remus in their undertaking, and they, in order to increase their numbers as much as possible, sent messengers around to the neighboring country inviting all who were disposed to come and take part of the building of the new city. This invitation was accepted by great numbers of people from every rank and station in life. Of course, however, the greater portion of those who came to join the enterprise were of a very low grade in respect to moral character. Men of industry, integrity, and moral worth, who possessed kind hearts and warm domestic affections, were generally well and prosperously settled, each in his own hamlet or town, and were little inclined to break away from the ties which bound them to friends and society, in order to plunge into such a scene of turmoil and confusion as the building of a new city, under such circumstances, must necessarily be. It was, of course, generally the discontented, the idle, and the bad, that would hope for benefit from such a change at this enterprise proposed to them. Every restless and desperate spirit, every depraved victim of vice, every fugitive and outlaw, would be ready to embark in such a scheme, which was to create certainly a new phase in their relations to society, and thus afford them an opportunity to make a fresh beginning. The enterprise, at the same time, seemed to offer them, through a new organization and new laws, some prospect of release from responsibility for former crimes. In a word, in preparing to lay the foundations of their city, Romulus and Remus found themselves at the head of a very wild and lawless company. There were 7 distinct hills on the ground which was subsequently included within the limits of Rome. Between and among these hills the river meandered by sweeping and graceful curves, and at one point, near the center of what is now the city, the stream passed very near the foot of one of the elevations called the Palatine Hill. Here was the spot where the wooden ark in which Romulus and Remus had been set adrift had been thrown up upon the shore. The sides of the hill were steep, and between it and the river there was in one part a deep morass. Romulus thought, on surveying the ground with Remus his brother, that this was the best spot for building the city. They could set apart a sufficient space of level ground around the foot of the hill for houses, enclosing the whole with a wall, while the top of the hill itself might be fortified to form the citadel. The wall and the steep acclivity of the ground would form a protection on 3 sides of the enclosure, while the morass alone would be a sufficient defense on the part toward the river. Then Romulus was especially desirous to select this spot as the site, as it was here that he and his brother had been saved from destruction in so wonderful a manner. Situation of Rome. Remus, however, did not concur in these views. A little further down the stream there was another elevation, called the Aventine Hill, which seemed to him more suitable for the site of a town. The sides were less precipitous, and thus were more convenient for building ground. Then the land in the immediate vicinity was better adapted to the purposes which they had in view. In a word, the Aventine Hill was, as Remus thought, for every substantial reason, much the best locality, and as for the fact of their having been washed ashore at the foot of the other hill, it was in his opinion an insignificant circumstance, wholly unworthy of being taken seriously into the account in laying the foundation of a city. The positions in which Remus and Romulus stood in respect to each other, and the feelings which were naturally awakened in their hearts by the circumstances in which they found themselves placed, were such as did not tend to allay any rising asperity which accident might occasion, but rather to irritate and inflame it. In the first place, they were both ardent, impulsive, and imperious. Each was conscious of his strength and eager to exercise it. Each wished to command, and was wholly unwilling to obey. While they were in adversity, they clung together for mutual help and protection. But now, when they had come into the enjoyment of prosperity and power, the bands of affection which had bound them together were very much weakened, and were finally sundered. Then there was nothing whatever to mark any superiority of one over the other. If they had been of different ages, the younger could have yielded to the elder in some degree without wounding his pride. If one had been more prominent than the other in effecting the revolution by which Romulus was dethroned, or if there had been a native difference of temperament or character to mark a distinction, or if either had been designated by numitor or selected by popular choice for the command, all might have been well. But there seemed, in fact, to be between them no grounds of distinction whatever. They were twins, so they neither could claim any advantage of birthright. They were equal in size, strength, activity, and courage. They had been equally bold and efficient in effecting the revolution, and now seemed equally powerful in respect to the influence with which they wielded over the minds of their followers. We have been so long accustomed to consider Romulus the more distinguished personage, through the associations connected with his name that have arisen from his subsequent career, that it is difficult for us to place him and his brother on that footing of perfect equality which they occupied in the estimation of all who knew them in this part of their history. This equality had caused no difference between them thus far, but now, since the advent of power and prosperity prevented their continuing longer on the level, there necessarily came up for decision the terrible question, terrible when two such spirits as theirs have to decide, which was to yield the palm. The brothers, therefore, having each expressed his preference in respect to the best place for the city, were equally unwilling to recede from the ground which they had taken. Remus thought that there was no reason why he should yield to Romulus, and Romulus was equally unwilling to give way to Remus. Neither could yield, in fact, without in some sense admitting the superiority of the other. the respective partisans of the two leaders began to take sides, and the dissension threatened to become a serious quarrel. Finally, being not yet quite ready for an open rupture, they concluded to refer the question to Numitor, and to abide by his decision. They expected that he would come and view the ground, and so decide where it was best that the city should be built, and thus terminate the controversy. But Numitor was too sagacious to hazard the responsibility of deciding between two such equally matched and powerful opponents. He endeavored to soothe and quiet the excited feelings of his grandsons, and finally recommended to them to appeal to augury to decide the question. Augury was a mode of ascertaining the divine will in respect to questions of expediency or duty, by means of certain prognostications and signs. These omens were of various kinds, but perhaps the most common were the appearances observed in watching the flight of birds through the air. It was agreed between Remus and Romulus, in accordance with the advice of Numitor, that the question at issue between them should be decided in this way. They were to take their stations on the two hills respectively, the Palatine and the Aventine, and watch for vultures. The homes of the vultures of Italy were among the summits of the Apennines, and their function in the complicated economy of animal life was to watch from the lofty peaks of mountains, or from the still more aerial and commanding positions which they found in soaring at vast elevations in the air, for the bodies of the dead, whether of men after a battle, or of a sheep or cattle, or wild beasts of the forest, killed by accident or dying of age, and when found to remove and devour them, and thus to hasten the return of the lifeless elements to other forms of animal and vegetable life. What the earth and the right of burial effects for man in advanced and cultivated stages of society, the vultures of the Apennines were commissioned to perform for all the animal communities of Italy in Numitor's time. To enable the vulture to accomplish the work assigned him, he is endowed with an inconceivable strength of wing to sustain his flight over the vast distances which he has to traverse, and up to the vast elevations to which he must sometimes soar, and also with some mysterious and extraordinary sense, whether of sight or smell, to enable him readily to find, at any hour, the spot where his presence is required, however remote or however hidden it may be. Guided by this instinct, he flies from time to time with a company of his fellows from mountain to mountain, or wheels slowly in vast circles over the plains, surveying the whole surface of the ground, and assuredly finding his work, finding it too equally easily, whether it lie exposed in the open field or is hidden, no matter how secretly, in forest, thicket, grove, or glen. It was to certain appearances indicated in the flight of these birds, such as the number that were seen at a time, the quarter of the heavens in which they appeared, the direction in which they flew, as from left to right, or from right to left, that the people of Numitor's day were accustomed to look for omens and auguries. So Romulus and Remus took their stations on the hills to which they had severely chosen, and surrounded by a company of his own adherents and friends, and began to watch the skies. It was agreed that the decision of the question between the two hills should be determined by the omens which should appear to the respective observers stationed upon them. But it happened, unfortunately, that the rules for the interpretation of auguries and omens were far too indefinite and vague to answer the purpose for which they were now appealed to. The most unequivocal distinctness and directness in giving its responses is a very essential requisite in any tribunal that is called upon as an umpire to settle disputes. While the ancient auguries and oracles were always susceptible of a great variety of interpretations, when Remus and Romulus commenced their watch, no vultures were to be seen from either hill. They waited till evening; still none appeared. They continued to watch through the night. In the morning a messenger came over from the Palatine Hill to Remus on the Aventine, informing him that vultures had appeared to Romulus. Remus did not believe it. At last, however, the birds really came into view. A flock of 6 were seen by Remus, and afterward one of 12 by Romulus. The observations were then suspended, and the parties came together to confer in respect to the results. But the dispute, instead of being settled, was found to be in a worse condition than ever. The point now to be determined was whether 6 vultures seen first, or 12 seen afterward, were the better omen. That is, whether numbers, or simply priority of appearance, should decide the question. In contending in respect to this nice point, the brothers became more angry with each other than ever. Their respective partisans took sides in the contest, which resulted finally in an open and violent collision. Romulus and Remus themselves seem to have commenced the affray by attacking one another. Fastulius, their foster father, who, from having had the care of them from their earliest infancy, felt for them an almost parental affection, rushed between them to prevent them from shedding each other's blood. He was struck down and killed on the spot by some unknown hand. A brother of Fastulius, too, named Listinus, who had lived near to him, and had known the boys from their infancy, and had often assisted in taking care of them, was killed in the endeavor to aid his brother to appease the tumult. At length the disturbance was quelled. The result of the conflict was, however, to show that Romulus and his party were the strongest. Romulus accordingly went on to build the walls of the city at the spot which he had first chosen. The lines were marked out, and the excavations were commenced with great ceremony. In laying out the work, the first thing to be done was to draw the lines of what was called the porarium. The porarium was a sort of symbolic wall, and was formed simply by turning a furrow with the plough all around the city, at a considerable distance from the real walls, for the purpose, not of establishing lines of defense, but of marking out what were to be the limits of the corporation, so to speak, for legal and ceremonial purposes. Of course, the porarium included a much greater space than the real walls, and the people were allowed to build houses anywhere within this outer enclosure, or even without it, though not very near to it. Those who built were thus, of course, not protected in case of an attack, and of course they would in such case be compelled to abandon their houses and retreat for safety within the proper walls. So Romulus proceeded to mark out the perimeter of the city, employing in the work the ceremonies customary on such occasions. The plough used was made of copper, and for a team to draw it, a bullock and heifer were yoked together. Men appointed for the purpose followed the plough, and carefully turned over the clods toward the wall of the city. This seems to have been considered an essential part of the ceremony. At the places where roads were to pass in toward the gates of the city, the plough was lifted out of the ground and carried over the requisite space, so as to leave the turf at those points unbroken. This was a necessary precaution, for there was a certain consecrating influence that was exerted by this ceremonial ploughing, which hallowed the ground wherever it passed in a manner that would very seriously interfere with its usefulness as a public road. The form of the space enclosed by the porarium, as Romulus ploughed it, was nearly square, and it included not merely the Palatine Hill itself, but a considerable portion of level land around it. Though Romulus thus seemed to have conquered in the strife with Remus, the difficulty was not yet fully settled. Remus was very little disposed to acquiesce in his brother's assumed superiority over him. He was sullen, morose, and ill at ease, and was inclined to take little part at the proceedings which were going on. Finally, an occasion occurred which produced a crisis, and brought the rivalry and enmity of the brothers suddenly and forever to an end. Remus was one day standing by a part of the wall which his brother's workmen were building, and expressing in various ways and with great freedom his opinions of his brother's plans, And finally he began to speak contemptuously of the wall which the workmen were building. Romulus all the time was standing by. At length, in order to enforce what he said about the insufficiency of the work, Remus leaped over a portion of it, saying, "This is the way the enemy will leap over your wall." Hereupon Romulus seized a mattox from the hands of one of the laborers, and struck his brother down to the ground with it, saying, "And this is the way that we will kill them if they do." Remus was killed by the blow. As soon as the deed was done, Romulus was at once overwhelmed with remorse and horror at the atrocity of the crime which he had been so suddenly led to commit. His anguish was so great for a time that he refused all food, and he could not sleep. He caused the body of Remus, and also those of Fastulius and Listinus, the brother of Fastulius, to be buried with the most solemn and imposing funeral ceremonies, so as to render all possible honor to their memory. And then, not satisfied with this, he instituted and celebrated certain religious rites to prevent the ghosts of the deceased from coming back to haunt him. The ghosts or specters of the dead that came back to haunt and terrify the living were called the Lemures. Hence the celebration which Romulus ordained was called the Lumeria, and it continued to be annually observed in Rome during the whole period of its subsequent history. Precisely what the ceremonies were which Romulus performed to appease the spirit of his brother can not now be ascertained, as there was no particular description of them recorded, but the Lumeria, as afterward performed, were frequently described by Roman writers, and they were of very curious and extraordinary character. The time for the celebration of these rites was in May, the anniversary, as was supposed, of the days in which Romulus originally celebrated them. The Lemurial ceremonies extended through 3 days, or rather nights, although for some curious reason or other they were alternate and not consecutive nights. They were the nights of the 9th, 11th, and 13th of May. The ceremonies were performed in the night, for the reason that it was in the dark hours that the ghosts and goblins were accustomed, as was supposed, to roam about the world to haunt and terrify men. The ceremonies performed on these occasions are thus described. They commenced at midnight. The father of the family would rise at that hour and go out at the door of the house, making certain gesticulations and signals with his hands, which were supposed to have the effect of keeping the spectres away. He then washed his hands 3 times in pure spring water. Then he filled his mouth with a certain kind of black beans, for which ghosts were supposed to have some particular fondness. Being thus provided, he would walk along, taking the beans out of his mouth as he walked, throwing them behind him. The spectres were supposed to gather up these beans as he threw them down. He must, however, by no means look round to see them. He then, after speaking certain mysterious and cabalistic words, washed his hands again, and then, making a frightful noise by striking brass basins together, he shouted out 9 times, "Ghost of this house, begone!" This was supposed effectually to drive the spectres away, an opinion which was always abundantly confirmed by the fact, for on looking round after this vociferated adjuration, the man always found that the spectres were gone. When by these ceremonies, or ceremonies such as these, Romulus had appeased the spirit of his brother, and those of the guardians of his childhood, his mind became more composed, and he turned his attention once more toward the building of the city. The party of Remus now, of course, since it was deprived of its head, no longer maintained itself, but was gradually broken up and merged in the general mass. Romulus became the sole leader of the enterprise, and immediately turned his attention to the measures to be adopted for a more complete and effectual organization of the community over which he found himself presiding. In respect to Remus, it ought perhaps to be added that after his death a story was circulated in Rome that it was a man named Celer, not Romulus, that killed him. This story, has not, however, been generally believed. It has been thought more probable that Romulus himself, or some of his partisans and friends, invented and circulated the story of Celer, in order to screen him in some degree from the reproach of so unnatural a crime as the killing of a brother so near and dear to him as Remus had been, a brother who had shared his infancy with him, who had slept with him at the same time in the arms of his mother, who had floated with him down the Tiber in the same ark, been saved from death by the same miraculous intervention, and through all the years of infancy, childhood, and youth had been his constant playmate, companion, and friend. The crime was as much more atrocious than any ordinary fratricide, as Remus had been nearer to Romulus than any ordinary brother. End of chapter 9. Recorded by hearhis.com.
Chapter 10 of Romulus. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ted Garvin. Romulus by Jacob Abbott. Chapter 10. Organization. BC 754. There has been a great deal of philosophical discussion and much debate among historians and chronologists in attempting to fix the precise year in which Romulus commenced the building of Rome. The difficulty arises from the fact that no regular records of public events were made in those ancient days. In modern times, such records are very systematically kept, and the express object of them being to preserve and perpetuate a knowledge of the exact truth in respect to the time, and the attendant circumstances relating to all great transactions. On the other hand, the memory of public events in early periods of the world was preserved only through tradition, and tradition cares little for the exact and the true. She seeks only for what is entertaining, her function being simply to give pleasure to successive generations of listeners by exciting their curiosity and wonder with tales, which, the more strange and romantic they are, the better they are suited to her purpose. She concerns herself very little with such simple verities as dates and names. The exposure of the twin infants of Rhea, supposing such an event to have actually happened, she remembered well, and repeated the narrative of it, adorning it, doubtless, with many embellishments, from age to age, so that the whole story comes down to modern times in full detail. But as to the time when the event took place, she gave herself no concern. The date would have added nothing to the romance of the story, and thus it was neglected and forgotten. In subsequent times, however, when regular historical annals began to be recorded, chronologists attempted to reason backward from events whose periods were known, through various data which they ingeniously obtained from the preceding and less formal narratives, until they obtained the dates of earlier events by a species of calculation. In this way, the time for the building of Rome was determined to be about the year 754 before Christ. As to Romulus himself, the tradition is that he was but 18 or 20 years old when he commenced the building of it. If this is true, his extreme youth goes far to palliate some of the wrongs which he perpetuated, wrongs which would have been far more inexcusable if committed with the deliberate purpose of middle life, than if prompted by the unthinking impulses and passions of 18. A certain Roman philosopher, named Varro, who lived some centuries after the building of the city, conceived of a very ingenious plan for discovering the year in which Romulus was born. It was this: by means of the science of astrology, as practiced in those days, certain learned magicians used to predict what the life and fortunes of any man would be, from the aspects and phases of the planets and other heavenly bodies at the time of his birth. The idea of Varro was to reverse this process in the case of Romulus, that is, to deduce from the known facts of his history what must have been the relative situations of the planets and stars when he came into the world. He accordingly applied to a noted astrologer to work out the problem for him. Given a history of the incidents and events occurring to the man in his progress through life, required the exact condition of the skies when the child was born. In other words, the astrologer was to determine what must have been the relative possessions of the sun, moon, and stars at the birth of Romulus, in order to produce a being whose life should exhibit such transactions and events as those which appeared in Romulus's subsequent history. When the astrologer had thus ascertained the condition of the skies at the time in question, the astronomers, as Varro concluded, could easily calculate the month and the year when the combination must have occurred. Now, it was the custom in those days to reckon by Olympiads, which were periods of 4 years, the series commencing with a great victory at a foot race in Greece, won by a man named Remus, from which event originated the Olympian Games, which were afterwards celebrated every 4 years, and which in subsequent ages became so renowned. The time when Remus ran his race, and thus furnished an era for all the subsequent chronologists and historians of his country, is generally regarded as about the year 776 before Christ, and the result of the calculations of Varro's astrologer, and of the astronomers who perfected it, was, that to lead such a life as Romulus led, a man must have been born at a time corresponding with the first year of the second Olympiad, that is, taking off from 776, 4 years for the first Olympiad. The first year of the second Olympiad would be 772. This would make the time of his birth 772 before Christ, and then deducing 18 years more, for the age of Romulus when he began to build his wall, we have 754 before Christ as the era of the foundation of Rome. This method of determining a point in chronology seems so absurd, according to the ideas of the present day, that we can hardly resist the conclusion that Varro, in making his investigation, was really guided by other and more satisfactory modes of determining the point, and that the horoscope was not what he actually relied upon. However this may be, the error which he fixed upon has been very generally received, though many others have been proposed by the different learned men who have successively investigated the question. According to the accounts given by the early writers, the constructions which Romulus and his companions made were of a very rude and simple character, such as might have been expected from a company of boys. For boys we ought perhaps to consider them all, since it is not to be presumed that the troop, in respect to age and experience, would be much in advance of the leaders. The wall which they built about the city was probably only a substantial stone fence, and their houses were huts and hovels. Even the palace, for there was a building erected for Romulus himself which was called the palace, was made, it is said, of rushes. Perhaps the meaning is that it was thatched with rushes, or possibly the expression refers to a mode of building sometimes adopted in the earlier stages of civilization, in which straw or rushes or some similar material is mixed with mud or clay to help bind the mass together, the whole being afterward dried in the sun. Walls thus made have been found to possess much more strength and durability than would be supposed possible for such a material to attain. However this may be, the hamlet of huts which Romulus and his wild coadjutors built and walled in must have appeared, at the time, to all observers, a very rude and imperfect attempt at building a city. In fact, it must have seemed to them, if it is true that Romulus was at that time only 18 years old, more like a frolic of thoughtless boys than a serious enterprise of men. Romulus, however, whatever others may have thought of his work, was wholly in earnest. He felt that he was a prince, and proud of his birth, and fully conscious of his intellectual and personal power. He determined that he would have a kingdom. It seems, however, that thus far he had not been considered as possessing anything like regal authority over his company of followers, but had been regarded only as a sort of chieftain exercising an undefined and temporary power, for as soon as the huts were built and the enclosures made, he is said to have convened an assembly of the people for consultation in respect to the plan of government that they should form. Romulus introduced the business of this meeting by a speech appropriate to the occasion, which speech is reported by an ancient historian somewhat as follows. Whether Romulus actually spoke the words thus attributed to him, or whether the report contains only what the reporter himself imagined him to say, there is now no means of knowing. "We have now," said Romulus, according to this record, "completed the building of our city, so far as at present we are able to do it, and it must be confessed that if we were required to depend for protection against a serious attack from an enemy on the height of our walls, or on their strength and solidity, our prospects would not be very encouraging. But our walls, we must remember, are not what we rely upon. No walls can be so high that an enemy cannot scale them. The dependence must be, after all, on the men within the city, and not on the ramparts and entrenchments which surround it, whatever those ramparts and entrenchments may be. We must therefore rely upon ourselves, for our safety, upon our valor, our discipline, our union and harmony. It is courage and energy in the people, not strength and outward defences, on which the safety and prosperity of a state must depend. The great work before us, therefore, is yet to be done. We have to organize a government under which order and discipline may come in, to control and direct our energies, and prepare us to meet whatever future exigencies may arise, whether of peace or war. What form shall be given to this government is the question that you have now to consider. I have learned by inquiry that there are various modes of government adopted among men, and between these we have now to decide. Shall our commonwealth be governed by one man, or shall we select a certain number of the wisest and bravest of the citizens, and commit the administration of public affairs to them? Or, in the third place, shall we commit the management of the government to the control of the people at large? Each of these three forms has its advantages, and each is attended with its own peculiar dangers. You are to choose between them. Only when the decision is once made, let us all unite in maintaining the government which shall be established, whatever its form may be. The result of the deliberation which followed, after the delivery of this address, was that the government of the state should be, like the government of Alba, under which the followers of Romulus had been born, a monarchy, and that Romulus himself should be king. He was a prince by birth, an inheritor of regal rank and power, by regular succession, from a line of kings. He had shown himself, too, by his deeds, to be worthy of power. He was courageous, energetic, sagacious, and universally esteemed. It was decided accordingly that he should be king, and he was proclaimed such by all the assembled multitude, with long and loud acclamations. Notwithstanding the apparent unanimity and earnestness of the people, however, in calling Romulus to the throne, he evinced, as the story goes, the proper degree of that reluctance and hesitation which a suitable regard to appearances seems, in all ages, to require of public men, when urged to accept of power. He was thankful to the people for the marks of their confidence, but he could not consent to assume the responsibilities and prerogatives of power until the choice made by his countrymen had been confirmed by the divinities of the land. So he resolved on instituting certain solemn religious ceremonies, during the progress of which he hoped to receive some manifestation of the divine will. These ceremonies consisted principally of sacrifices which he caused to be offered on the plain near the city. While Romulus was engaged in these services, the expected token of the divine approval appeared in a supernatural light which shone upon his hand. At least it was said that such a light was seen, and the appearing of it was considered as clearly confirming the right of Romulus to the throne. He no longer made any objection to assuming the government of the new city as its acknowledged king. The first object to which he gave his attention was the organization of the people, and the framing of the general constitution of society. The community over which he was called to preside had consisted thus far of very heterogeneous and discordant materials. Vast numbers of the people were of the humblest and most degraded condition, consisting of ignorant peasants, some stupid, others turbulent and ungovernable, and of refugees from justice, such as thieves, robbers, and outlaws of every degree. But then, on the other hand, there were many persons of standing and respectability. The sons of families of wealth and influence in Alba had, in many cases, joined the expedition, and at last, when the building of the city had advanced so far as to make it appear that the enterprise might succeed, more men of age and character came to join it, so that Romulus found himself, when he formally assumed the kingly power, at the head of a community which contained the elements of a very respectable commonwealth. These elements were, however, thus far all mingled together in complete confusion, and the work was first to be done was to adopt some plan for classifying and arranging them. It is most probable, as a matter of fact, that the organization and the institutions which in subsequent times appeared in the Roman state were not deliberately planned and formally introduced by Romulus at the outset, but that they gradually grew up in the progress of time, and that afterward historians and philosophers, in speculating upon them at their leisure, carried back the history of them to the earliest times, in order, by so doing, to honor the founder of the city, and also to exalt and aggrandize the institutions themselves in public estimation, by celebrating the antiquity and dignity of their origin. The institutions which Romulus actually founded were of a very republican character, if the accounts of subsequent writers are to be believed. He established, it is true, a gradation of ranks, but the most important offices, civil and military, were filled, it is said, by election on the part of the people. In the first place, the whole population was divided into three portions, which were called tribes, which word was formed from the Latin word tres, meaning three. These tribes chose each 3 presiding officers, selecting for the purpose the oldest and most distinguished of their number. It is probable, in fact, that Romulus himself really made the selection, and that the action of the people was confined to some sort of expression of assent and concurrence, for it is difficult to imagine how any other kind of election than this could be possible among so rude and ignorant a multitude. The tribes were then subdivided into 30 counts or counties, and each of these likewise elected its head. Thus there was a large body of magistrates or chieftains appointed, 99 in number, namely 9 heads of tribes and 90 heads of counties. Romulus himself added one to the number of his own independent selection, which made the 100th. The men thus chosen constituted what was called the Senate. They formed the great legislative council of the nation. They and the families descending from them became, in subsequent times, an aristocratic and privileged class, called the patricians. The remaining portion of the population were called plebeians. The plebeians comprised, of course, the industrial and useful classes, and were in rank and station inferior to the patricians. They were, however, not all upon a level with each other, for they were divided into 2 great classes, called patrons and clients. The patrons were the employers, the proprietors, the men of influence and capital. The clients were the employed, the dependent, the poor. The clients were to perform services of various kinds for the patrons, and the patrons were to reward, to protect, and to defend the clients. All these arrangements Romulus is said to have ordained by his enactments, and thus introduced as elements in the social constitution of the state. It is more probable, however, that instead of being thus expressly established by the authority of Romulus as a lawgiver, they gradually grew up of themselves, perhaps with some fostering attention and care on his part, and possibly under some positive regulation of law. For such important and complicated relations as these are not of a nature to be easily called into existence and action, in an extended and unorganized community, by the mere fiat of a military chieftain. Perhaps, however, it is not intended by the ancient historians, in referring all these complicated arrangements of the Roman civil polity to the enactments of Romulus, to convey the idea that he introduced them at once in all their completeness at the outset of his reign. Romulus continued king of Rome for nearly 40 years, and instead of making formal and positive enactments, he may have gradually introduced the arrangements ascribed to him as usages, which he fostered and encouraged, confirming and sanctioning them from time to time, when occasion required, by edicts and laws. However this may have been, it is certain that Romulus, in the course of his reign, laid the foundation of the future greatness and glory of Rome, by the energy with which he acted in introducing order, system, and discipline into the community which he found gathered around him. He seems to have had the sagacity to perceive from the outset that the great evil and danger which he had to fear was the prevalence of the spirit of disorder and misrule among his followers. In fact, nothing but tumult and confusion was to have been expected from such a lawless horde as his, and even after the city was built, the presumption must have been very strong in the mind of any considerate and prudent man against the possibility of ever regulating and controlling such a mass of heterogeneous and discordant materials by any human means. Romulus saw, however, that in effecting this purpose lay the only hope of the success of his enterprise, and he devoted himself with great assiduity and care, and at the same time with great energy and success, to the work of organizing it. The great leading objects of his life, from the time that he commenced the government of the new city, were to arrange and regulate social institutions, to establish laws, to introduce discipline, to teach and to accustom men to submit to authority, and to bring in the requirements of law and the authority of the various recognized relations of social life to control and restrain the wayward impulses of the natural heart. As a part of this system of policy, he laid great stress upon the parental and family relation. He saw in the tie which binds the father to the child and the child to the father a natural bond which he foresaw would greatly aid him in keeping the turbulent and boisterous propensities of human nature under some proper control. He accordingly magnified and confirmed the natural force of parental authority by adding the sanctions of law to it. He defined and established the power of the father to govern and control the son, rightly considering that the father is the natural ally of the state in restraining young men from violence, and enforcing habits of industry and order upon them, at an age when they most need control. He clothed parents, therefore, with authority to fulfill this function, considering that what he thus aided them to do was so much saved for the civil magistrate and the state. In fact, he carried this so far that it is said that the dependence of the child upon the father, under the institutions of Romulus, was more complete, and was protracted to a later period than was the case under the laws of any other nation. The power of the father over his household was supreme. He was a magistrate, as far as his children were concerned, and could thus not only require their services, and inflict light punishments for disobedience upon them, as with us, but he could sentence them to the severest penalties of the law, if guilty of crime. The laws were equally stringent in respect to the marriage tie. Death was the penalty for the violation of their marriage vows. All property belonged to the husband and to the wife was held by them in common. And the wife, if she survived the husband, and if the husband died without a will, became his sole heir. In a word, the laws of Romulus evince a very strong desire on the part of the legislator to contain the sacredness and to magnify the importance of the family tie, and to avail himself of those instinctive principles of obligation and duty which so readily arise in the human mind out of the various relations of the family state, in the plans which he formed for subduing the impulses and regulating the action of his rude community. He devoted great attention, too, to the institutions of religion. He knew well that such lawless and impetuous spirits as his could never be fully subdued and held in proper subordination to the rules of social order and moral duty without the influence of motives drawn from the spiritual world, and he accordingly adopted vigorous measures for confirming and perpetuating such religious observances as were at that time observed, and in introducing others. Every public act which he performed was always accompanied by and sanctioned by religious solemnities. The rites and ceremonies which he instituted seem puerile to us, but they were full of meaning and of efficacy in the view of those who performed them. There was, for example, a class of religious functionaries called augurs, whose office it was to interpret the divine will by means of certain curious indications which it was their special profession to understand. There were 3 of these augurs, and they were employed on all public occasions, both in peace and war, to ascertain from the omens whether the enterprise or the work in regard to which they were consulted was or was not favoured by the counsels of heaven. If the augury was propitious, the work was entered upon with vigour and confidence. If otherwise, it was postponed or abandoned. The omens which the augurs observed were of various kinds, being drawn sometimes from certain peculiarities in the form and structure of the internal organs of animals offered in sacrifice, sometimes from the appearance of birds in the sky, their numbers, or the direction of their flight, and sometimes from the forms of clouds, the appearance of the lightning, and the sound of the thunder. Whenever the augurs were to take the auspices from any of the signs of the sky, the process was this. They would go with solemn ceremony to some high place. In Rome there was a station expressly consecrated to this purpose on the Capitoline Hill, and there, with a sort of magical wand which they had for the purpose, one of the number would determine and indicate the 4 quarters of the heaven, pointing out in a solemn manner the directions of east, west, north, and south. The augur would then take his stand with his back to the west, and his face of course to the east. The north would then be on his left hand, and the south at his right. He would then, in this position, watch for the signs. If it was from the thunder that the auspices were to be taken, the augur would listen to hear from what quarter of the heavens it came. If the lightning appeared in the east, and the sound of the thunder seemed to come from the northward, the presage was favourable. So it was if the chain of lightning seen in the sky appeared to pass from cloud to cloud above, instead of descending to the ground. On the other hand, thunder sounding as if it came from the southward, and lightning striking down to the earth, were both unpropitious omens. As to birds, some were of good omen, as vultures, eagles, and woodpeckers. Others were evil, as ravens and owls. Various inferences were drawn too from the manner in which the birds that appeared in the air were seen to fly, and from the sound of their note at the time when the observation was made. By these and many similar means the government of Romulus vainly endeavoured to ascertain the will of heaven in respect to the plans and enterprises in which they were called upon from time to time to engage. There was perhaps in these observances much imposture and much folly, still they could only have been sustained, in their influence and ascendancy over the minds of the people, by a sincere veneration on their part for some unseen and spiritual power, and a reverent desire to conform the public measures of their government to what they supposed to be the divine will. By such measures as we have thus described, Romulus soon produced order out of confusion within his little commonwealth. The enterprise which he had undertaken, and the great success which had thus far followed it, attracted great attention, and he soon found that great numbers began to come in from all the surrounding country to join him. Many of these were persons of still worse character than those who had adhered to him at first, and he soon found that to admit them indiscriminately into the city would be to endanger the process of organization which was now so well begun. He accordingly set apart a hill near to his city called the Capitoline Hill, as an asylum for them, where they could remain in safety under regulations suitable to their condition, and without interfering with the arrangements which he had made for the rest. This asylum soon became a very attractive place for all the vagabonds, outlaws, thieves, and robbers of the country. Romulus welcomed them all, and as fast as they came he busied himself with plans to furnish them with employment and subsistence. He enlisted some of them in his army. Some he employed to cultivate the ground in the territory belonging to the city. Others were engaged as servants for the people within the walls, being taken into the city, in small numbers, from time to time, as fast as they could be safely received. In process of time, however, the walls of the city were extended so as to include the Capitoline Hill, and thus at last the whole mass was brought into Rome together. End of chapter 10.
Chapter 11 of Romulus. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Simon Wainwright. Romulus by Jacob Abbott. Chapter 11. Wives. BC 751. Every reader who has made even the smallest beginning in the study of ancient history must be acquainted in general with the mode which Romulus adopted to provide the people of his city with wives, by the transaction which is commonly called in history the rape of the Sabines. The deed itself, as it actually occurred, may perhaps have been one of great rudeness, violence, and cruelty. If so, the historians who described it contrived to soften the character of it, and to divest it in a great measure of the repulsive features which might have been supposed to characterize such a transaction. For, according to the narrative which they give us, the whole proceeding was conducted in such a manner as to evince not only great ingenuity and sagacity on the part of Romulus and his government, but also great moderation and humanity. The circumstances, as the historians relate them, were these. As might naturally be supposed from the manner in which the company which formed the population of Rome had been collected, it consisted at first almost wholly of men. The laws and regulations referred to in the last chapter in respect to the family relation were those framed after the organization of the community had become somewhat advanced. Since at the outset there could be very few families, inasmuch as the company which first met together to build the city consisted simply of an army of young men, it is true that among those who joined them at first there were some men of middle life and some families. Still, as is always the case with new cities and countries suddenly and rapidly settled, the population consisted almost entirely of men. It was necessary that the men should have wives. There were several reasons for this. First, it was necessary for the comfort and happiness of the people themselves. A community of mere men is gloomy and desolate. Secondly, for the continuance and perpetuity of the state. It was necessary that there should be wives and children, so that when one generation should have passed away, there might be another to succeed it. And thirdly, for the preservation of order and law. Men unmarried are in the mass proverbially ungovernable. Nothing is so effectual in keeping a citizen away from scenes of tumult and riot as a wife and children at home. The fearful violence of the riots and insurrections of which the city of Paris has so often been the scene is explained in a great degree by the circumstance that so immense a proportion of the population are unmarried. They have no homes and no defenseless wives and children to fear for, and so they fear nothing, but give themselves up in times of public excitement to the wildest impulses of passion. Romulus seems to have understood this, and his first care was to provide the way by which as many as possible of his people should be married. The first measure which he adopted was to send ambassadors around the neighboring states, soliciting alliances with them, and stipulations allowing of intermarriages between his people and theirs. The proposal seemed not unreasonable, and it was made in an unassuming and respectful manner. In the message which Romulus commissioned the ambassadors to deliver, he admitted that his colony was yet small, and by no means equal in influence and power to the kingdoms whose alliance he desired. But he reminded those whom he addressed that great results came sometimes in the end from very inconsiderable beginnings, and that their enterprise thus far, though yet in its infancy, had been greatly prospered and was plainly the object of divine favor, and that the time might not be far distant when the new state would be able fully to reciprocate such favors as it might now receive. The neighboring kings to whom these ambassadors were sent rejected the proposals with derision. They did not even give serious answers, obviously considering the new city as a mere temporary gathering, an encampment of adventurers and outlaws, which would be as transient as it was rude and irregular. They looked to see it break up as suddenly and tumultuously as it had been formed. They accordingly sent back word to Romulus that he must resort to the same plan to get women for his city that he had adopted to procure recruits of men. He must open an asylum for them. The low and the dissolute would come flocking to him. Then, they said, from all parts, and vagabond women would make just the kind of wives for vagabond men. Of course, the young men of the city were aroused to an extreme pitch of indignation at receiving this response. They were clamorous for war. They wished Romulus to lead them out against some of these cities at once, and allow them at the same time to revenge the insults which they had received, and to provide themselves with wives by violence, since they could not obtain them by solicitation. But Romulus restrained their ardor, saying that they must do nothing rashly, and promising to devise a better way than theirs to attain the end. The plan which he devised was to invite the people of the surrounding states and cities, both men and women, to come to Rome, with a view of seizing some favorable occasion for capturing the women while they were there, and driving the men away. The difficulty in the way of the execution of this plan was obviously to induce the people to come, and especially to bring the young women with them. The native timidity of the maidens, joined to the contemptuous feelings which their fathers and brothers cherished in regard to everything pertaining to the new city would very naturally keep them away, unless something could be devised which would exert a very strong attraction. Romulus waited a little time in order that any slight excitement which had been produced by his embassy should have had time to subside, and then he made, or pretended to make, a great discovery in a field not far from his town. This discovery was the finding of an ancient altar to Neptune underground. The altar was brought to view by some workmen who were making excavations at the place. How it came to be underground and who had built it, no one knew. The rumor of this great discovery was spread immediately in every direction. Romulus attached great importance to the event. The altar had undoubtedly been built, he thought, by the ancient inhabitants of the country, and the finding it was a very momentous occurrence. It was proper that the occasion should be solemnized by suitable religious observances. Accordingly, arrangements were made for a grand celebration in addition to the religious rites. Romulus proposed that a great fair should be held on a plain near the city at the same time. Booths were erected, and the merchants of all the neighboring cities were invited to come, bringing with them such articles as they had for sale, and those who wished to buy were to come with their money. In a word, arrangements were made for a great and splendid festival. There were to be games, too, races and wrestling and other athletic sports, such as were in vogue in those times. The celebration was to continue for many days, and the games and sports were to come at the end. Romulus sent messengers to all the surrounding country to proclaim the program of these entertainments and to invite everybody to come, and he adroitly arranged the details in such a manner that the chief attractions for grave, sober-minded, and substantial men should be on the earlier days of the show, and that the latter days should be devoted to lighter amusements, such as would possess a charm for the young, the light-hearted, and the happy. It was among this last class that he naturally expected to find the maidens whom his men would choose in looking for wives. When the time arrived, the spectacles commenced. There was a great concourse at the outset, but the people who first came were, as Romulus supposed would be the case, chiefly men. They came in companies as if for mutual support and protection, and they exhibited, in a greater or less degree, an air of suspicion, watchfulness, and mistrust. They were, however, received with great cordiality and kindness. They were conducted about the town, and were astonished to find how considerable a town it was. The streets, the houses, the walls, the temples, simple in construction as they were, far surpassed the expectations they had formed. The visitors were treated with great hospitality, and entertained in a manner which, considering the circumstances of the case, was quite sumptuous. The women and children, too, who came on these first days, received from all the Romans very special attention and regard. As the celebrations went on, from day to day a considerable change took place in the character and appearance of the company. The men ceased to be suspicious and watchful. Some went home and carried such reports to the new city, and of the kindness and hospitality and gentle behavior of the inhabitants, that new visitors came continually to see for themselves. Every day the proportion of stern and suspicious men diminished, and that of gay and happy-looking youths and maidens increased. In the meantime The men of the city were under strict injunctions from Romulus to treat their guests in the most respectful manner, leaving them entirely at liberty to go and come as they pleased, except so far as they could detain them by treating them with kindness and attention, and devising new sports and amusements for them from day to day. Things continued in this state for 2 or 3 weeks, during all which time the new city was a general place of resort for the people of all the surrounding country. Of course, a great many agreeable acquaintances would naturally be formed between the young men of the city and their visitors, as accidental circumstances or individual choice and preference brought them together. And thus, without any directions on the subject from Romulus, each man would very naturally occupy himself in anticipation of the general seizure which he knew was coming, in making his selection beforehand of the maiden whom he intended, when the time for the seizure came, to make his own, and the maiden herself would probably be less terrified, and make less resistance to the attempt to capture her, than if it were by a perfect stranger that she was to be seized. All this Romulus seemed very arduously to have arranged. The time for the final execution of the scheme was to be the last day of the celebration. The best spectacle and show of all was to take place on that day. The Romans were directed to come armed to this show, but to keep their arms carefully concealed beneath their garments. They were to do nothing till Romulus gave the signal. He was himself to be seated upon a sort of throne, in a conspicuous place, where all could see him, presiding, as it were, over the assembly. While the spectacle went on, and finally, when he judged that the proper moment had arrived, he was to give the signal by taking off a certain loose article of dress which he wore, a sort of cloak or mantle, and folding it up, and then immediately unfolding it again. This mantle was a sort of badge of royalty, and was gaily adorned with purple stripes upon a white ground. It was well adapted, therefore, to the purpose of being used as a signal, inasmuch as any motions that were made with it could be very easily seen. Everything being thus arranged, the assembly was convened, and the games and spectacles went on. The Romans were full of excitement and trepidation, each one having taken his place as near as possible to the maiden whom he was intending to seize, and occupying himself with keeping his eye upon her as closely as he could, without seeming to do so, and at the same time watching the royal mantle, and every movement made by the wearer of it, that he might catch the signal the instant that it should be made. All this time the men among the guests at the entertainment were off their guard, and wholly at their ease, having no suspicion whatever of the mine that was ready to be sprung beneath them. The wives, mothers, and children too were all safe, as well as unsuspicious of danger, for Romulus had given special charge that no married woman should be molested. The men had had ample time and opportunity in the many days of active social intercourse which they had enjoyed with their guests to know who were free, and they were forbidden in any instance to take a wife away from her husband. At length the moment arrived for giving the signal. Romulus took off his mantle, folded it, and then unfolded it again. The Romans immediately drew their swords and rushed forward, each to secure his own prize. A scene of the greatest excitement and confusion ensued. The whole company of visitors perceived, of course, that some great act of treachery was perpetrated upon them, but they were wholly in the dark in respect to the nature and design of it. They were chiefly unarmed and wholly unprepared for so sudden an attack, and they fled in all directions in dismay, protecting themselves and their wives and children as well as they could as they retired, and aiming only to withdraw as large a number as possible from the scene of violence and confusion that prevailed. The Romans were careful not to do them any injury, but, on the contrary, they allowed them to withdraw and to take away all the mothers and children without any molestation. In fact, it was the very object and design of the onset which they made upon the company, not only to seize upon the maidens, but to drive all the rest of their visitors away. The men, therefore, in the excitement and terror of the moment, fled in all directions, taking with them those whom they could most readily secure, who were, of course, those whom the Romans left to them, while the Romans themselves withdrew with their prizes and secured them within the walls of the city. In reading this extraordinary story, we naturally feel a strong disposition to inquire what part the damsels themselves took when they found themselves thus suddenly seized and carried away by these daring and athletic assailants. Did they resist and struggle to get free, or did they yield themselves without much opposition to their fate? That they did not resist effectually is plain, for the Roman young men succeeded in carrying them away and securing them. It may be that they attempted to resist, but found their strength overpowered by the desperate and reckless violence of their captors. And yet it cannot be denied that woman is endued with the power of making, by various means, a very formidable opposition to any attempt to abduct her by any single man, when she is thoroughly in earnest about it. How it was in fact in this case we have no direct information, and we have consequently no means of forming any opinion in respect to the light in which this rough and lawless mode of wooing was regarded by the objects of it, except from the events which subsequently occurred. One incident took place while the Romans were seizing and carrying away their prizes, which was afterward long remembered, as it became the foundation of a custom which continued for many centuries to form a part of the marriage ceremony at Rome. It seems that some young men, very young and of a humble class, had seized a peculiarly beautiful girl, one of some note and consideration too among her countrywomen, and were carrying her away like the rest. Some other young Romans of the Patrician order, seeing this, and thus thinking that so beautiful a maiden ought not to fall to the share of such plebeians, immediately set out in full pursuit to rescue her. The plebeians hurried along to escape from them, calling out at the same time, "Thalasio, Thalasio," which means for Thalasius, for Thalasius. They meant by this to convey the idea that the prize which they had in possession was intended not for any one of their own number, but for Thalasius. Now Thalasius was a young noble, universally known and very highly esteemed by all his countrymen, and when the rescuing party were thus led to suppose that the beautiful lady was intended for him, they acquiesced immediately and desisted from their attempt to recapture her, and thus, by the aid of their stratagem, the plebeians carried off their prize in safety. When this circumstance came afterward to be known, the ingenuity of the young plebeians and the success of their maneuver excited very general applause, and the exclamation, Thalasio passed into a sort of proverb, and was subsequently adopted as an exclamation of assent and congratulation, to be used by the spectators at a marriage ceremony. Romulus had issued most express and positive orders that the young captives should be treated after their seizure in the kindest and most respectful manner, and should be subject to no violence and no ill treatment of any kind, other than that necessary for conveying them to the places of security previously designated. They suffered undoubtedly a greater or less degree of distress and terror, but finding that they were treated after their seizure with respectful consideration, and that they were left unmolested by their captors, they gradually recovered their composure during the night, and in the morning were quite self-possessed and calm. Their fathers and brothers in the meantime had gone home to their respective cities, taking with them the women and children that they had saved, and burning with indignation and rage against the perpetrators of such an act of treachery as had been practiced upon them. They were, of course, in a state of great uncertainty and suspense in respect to the fate which awaited the captives, and were soon eagerly engaged in forming and discussing all possible plans for rescuing and recovering them. Thus the night was passed in agitation and excitement, both within and without the city. The excitement of terror and distress, great, perhaps, though subsiding on the part of the captives, and of resentment and rage, which grew deeper and more extended every hour on the part of their countrymen. When the morning came, Romulus ordered the captive maidens to be all brought together before him, in order that he might make, as it were, an apology to them for the violence to which they had been subjected, and explain to them the circumstances which had impelled the Romans to resort to it. "You ought not," he said, "to look upon it as an indignity that you have been thus seized. For the object of the Romans in seizing you was not to dishonor you or to do you any injury, but only to secure you for their wives in honorable marriage. And far from being displeased with the extraordinariness of the measures which they were adopted to secure you, you ought to take pride in them, as evincing the ardor and strength of the affection with which you have inspired your lovers. I will assure you that when you have become their wives, you shall be treated with all the respect and tenderness that you have been accustomed to experience under your fathers' roofs. The brief coercion which we have employed for the purpose of securing you in the first instance, a coercion which we were compelled to resort to by the necessity of the case, is the only rudeness to which you will ever be exposed. Forgive us, then, for this one liberty which we have taken, and consider that the fault, whatever fault in it there may be, is not ours, but that of your fathers and brothers, who rejected our offers for voluntary and peaceful alliances, and thus compelled us to resort to this stratagem, or else to lose you altogether. Your destiny, if you unite with us, will be great and glorious. We have not taken you captive to make you prisoners or slaves, or to degrade you in any way from your former position, but to exalt you to positions of high consideration in a new and rising colony, a colony which is surely destined to become great and powerful, and of which we mean you to be the chief glory and charm." The young and handsome Romans stood by while Romulus made this speech, their countenances animated with excitement and pleasure. The maidens themselves seemed much inclined to yield to their fate. Their resentment gradually subsided, It has been, in fact, in all ages, characteristic of women to be easily led to excuse and forgive any wrong on the part of another which is prompted by love for herself. And these injured maidens seemed gradually to come to the conclusion that, considering all the circumstances of the case, their abductors were not so much in fault after all. In a short time an excellent understanding was established, and they were all married. There were, it is said, about 500 or 600 of them, and it proved that most of them were from the nation of the Sabines, a nation which inhabited a territory north of the colony of the Romans. The capital of the Sabines was a city called Cures. Cures was about 20 miles from Rome. The Sabines, in deliberating on the course which they should pursue in the emergency, found themselves in a situation of great perplexity. In the first place, the impulse which urged them to immediate acts of retaliation and hostility was restrained by the fact that so many of their beloved daughters were wholly in the power of their enemies, and they could not tell what cruel fate might await the captives if they were themselves to resort to any measures that would exasperate or provoke the captors. Then again, their own territory was very much exposed, and they were by no means certain, in case a war should be commenced between them and the Romans, how it would end. Their own population was much divided, being scattered over the territory, or settled in various cities and towns which were but slightly fortified, and consequently were much exposed to assault in case the Romans were to make an incursion into their country. In view of all these considerations, the Sabines concluded that it would be best for them, on the whole, to try the influence of gentle measures before resorting to open war. They therefore sent an embassy to Romulus to remonstrate in strong terms against the wrong which the Romans had done them by their treacherous violence, and to demand that the young women should be restored. "If you will restore them to us now," said they, "we will overlook the affront which you have put upon us, and make peace with you, and will enter into an alliance with you, so that hereafter your people and ours may be at liberty to intermarry in a fair and honorable way. But we cannot submit to have our daughters taken away from us by treachery and force." Reasonable as this proposition seems, Romulus did not think it best to accede to it. It was, in fact, too late, for such deeds, once done, can hardly be undone. Romulus replied that the women, being now the wives of the Romans, could not be surrendered. The violence, he said, of which the Sabines complained was unavoidable. No other possible way had been open to them for gaining the end. He was willing, he added, to enter into a treaty of peace and alliance with the Sabines, but that they must acknowledge as a preliminary to such a treaty the validity of the marriages which, as they had already been consummated, could not now be annulled. The Sabines, on their part, could not accede to these proposals. Being, however, still reluctant to commence hostilities, they continued the negotiations, though while engaged in them they seemed to anticipate an unfavorable issue, for they were occupied all the time in organizing troops, strengthening the defenses of their villages and towns, and making other vigorous preparations for war. The Romans in the meantime seemed to find the young wives which they had procured by these transactions a great acquisition to their colony. It proved, too, that they not only prized the acquisition, but they exulted so much in the ingenuity and success of the stratagem by which their object had been effected, that a sort of symbolic violence in taking the bride became afterward a part of the marriage ceremony in all subsequent weddings. For always in future years, when the new married wife was brought home to her husband's house, it was the custom for him to take her up in his arms at the door and carry her over the threshold as if by force, thus commemorating by this ceremony the coercion which had signalized the original marriages of his ancestors, the founders of Rome. End of chapter 11. Reading by Simon Wainwright. Chapter 12 of Romulus. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Simon Wainwright. Romulus by Jacob Abbott. Chapter 12. The Sabine War, B.C. 750 through 746. While the negotiations with the Sabines were still pending, Romulus became involved in another difficulty, which for a time assumed a very threatening aspect. This difficulty was a war which broke out somewhat suddenly in consequence of the invasion of the Roman territories by a neighboring chieftain named Acron. Acron was the sovereign of a small state whose capital was a town called Saenina. This Saenina is supposed to have been only 4 or 5 miles distant from Romulus's city, a fact which shows very clearly on how small a scale the deeds and exploits connected with the first foundation of the great empire, which afterward became so extended and so renowned, were originally performed, and how intricately insignificant they were in themselves, though momentous in the extreme in respect to the consequences that flowed from them. Acron was a bold, energetic, and determined man, who had already acquired great fame by his warlike exploits, and who had long been watching the progress of the new colony with an evil eye. He thought that if it were allowed to take root and to grow, it might at some future day become a formidable enemy, both to him and also to the other states in that part of Italy. He had been very desirous, therefore, of finding some pretext for attacking the new city, and when he heard of the seizure of the Sabine women, he thought that the time had arrived. He therefore urged the Sabines to make war at once upon the Romans, and promised, if they would do so, to assist them with all the forces that he could command. The Sabines, however, were so unwilling to proceed to extremities, and spent so much time in negotiations and embassies, that Acron's patience was at length wholly exhausted by the delays, and he resolved to undertake the extermination of the new colony himself alone. So he gathered together a rude and half-organized army, and advanced toward Rome. Romulus, who had been informed of his plans and preparations, went out to meet him. The two armies came in view of each other on an open plain not far from the city. Romulus advanced at the head of his troops, while Acron appeared likewise in the forefront of the invaders. After uttering, in the hearing of each other, and of the assembled armies various exclamations of challenge and defiance, it was at length agreed that the question at issue should be decided by single combat, the two commanders themselves to be the champions. Romulus and Acron accordingly advanced into the middle of the field, while their armies drew up around them, forming a sort of ring within which the combatants were to engage. The interest which would be naturally felt by such an encounter was increased very much by the strong contrast that was observed in the appearance of the warriors. Romulus was very young, and though tall and athletic in form, his countenance exhibited still the expression of softness and delicacy characteristic of youth. Acron, on the other hand, was a war-worn veteran, rugged, hardy, and stern. And the throngs of martial spectators that surrounded the field when they saw the combatants as they came forward to engage anticipated a very unequal contest. Romulus was, nevertheless, victorious. As he went into the battle, he made a vow to Jupiter that if he conquered his foe, he would ascribe to the god all the glory of the victory, and he would set up the arms and spoils of Acron at Rome as a trophy sacred to Jupiter, in honor of the divine aid through which the conquest should be achieved. It was in consequence of this vow, as the old historians say, that Romulus prevailed in the combat. At all events he did prevail. Acron was slain, and while Romulus was stripping the fallen body of its armor on the field, his men were pursuing the army of Acron, for the soldiers fled in dismay toward their city as soon as they saw the single combat had gone against their king. Senina was not in a condition to make any defense, and it was readily taken. When the city was thus in the power of Romulus, he called the inhabitants together, and said to them that he cherished no hostile or resentful feelings toward them. On the contrary, he wished to have them his allies and friends, and he promised them that if they would abandon Senina and go with him to Rome, they should all be received as brothers, and be at once incorporated into the Roman state, and admitted to all the privileges of citizens. The people of Senina, when the first feelings of terror and distress, which their falling into the power of their enemies naturally awakened, had been in some measure allayed, readily acquiesced in this arrangement, and were all transferred to Rome. Their coming made a great addition not only to the population and strength of the city, but vastly increased the celebrity and fame of Romulus in the estimation of the surrounding nations. The victory over Acron and the annexation of his dominions to the Roman commonwealth, when the first feelings of terror and distress, which their falling into the power of their enemies naturally awakened, had been in some measure allayed, readily acquiesced in this arrangement, and were all transferred to Rome. Their coming made a great addition not only to the population and strength of the city, but vastly increased the celebrity and fame of Romulus in the estimation of the surrounding nations. This victory over Acron and the annexation of his dominions to the Roman commonwealth are considered of great historical importance as the original type and exemplar of the whole subsequent foreign policy of the Roman state, a policy marked by courage and energy in martial action on the field, and by generosity in the dealing with the conquered, and which was so successful in its results that it was the means of extending the Roman power from kingdom to kingdom and from continent to continent, until the vast organization almost encircled the world. Romulus faithfully fulfilled the vow which he had made to Jupiter. On the return of the army to Rome, the soldiers, by his directions, cut down a small oak tree, and trimmed the branches at the top, and shortened them as much as was necessary for the purpose. They hung the weapons and armor of Akron upon it, and marched with it thus in triumph into the city. Romulus walked in the midst of the procession, a crown of laurel upon his head, and his long hair hanging down upon his shoulders. Thus the victors entered the city, greeted all the way by the shouts and acclamations of the people who had assembled, men, women, and children, at the gates and upon the tops of the houses. When the long procession had thus passed in, tables for the soldiers were spread in the streets and public squares, and the whole day was spent in festivity and rejoicing. This was the first Roman triumph, the original model and example of those magnificent and imposing spectacles which in subsequent ages became the wonder of the world. The spoils which had been brought in upon the oak were solemnly set up on one of the hills within the city as a trophy to Jupiter. A small temple was erected expressly to receive them. This temple was very small, being but 5 feet wide and 10 feet long. A short time after these transactions, 2 other cities were incorporated into the Roman state. The name of these cities were Crustumenium and Atene. Some women from these cities had been seized at Rome when the Sabine women were taken, and the inhabitants have been ever since that period meditating plans of revenge. They were not strong enough to wage open war against Romulus, but they began at last to make hostile incursions into the Roman territories by means of such small bands of armed men as they had the means of raising. Romulus immediately organized bodies of troops sufficient for the purpose, and then suddenly, and as it would seem without giving the kings of these cities any previous warning, he appeared before the walls and captured the cities before the inhabitants had time to recover from their consternation. He then sent to all the women in Rome who had formerly belonged to these cities, summoning them to appear before him at his public place of audience in the city, and in the presence of the Roman Senate. The women were exceedingly terrified at receiving this summons. They supposed that death or some other terrible punishment was to be inflicted upon them in retribution for the offenses committed by their countrymen. And they came into the Senate house, hiding their faces in their robes, and crying out with grief and terror. Romulus bid them calm their fears, assuring them that he intended them no injury. Your countrymen, he said, preferred war to the peaceful alternative of friendship and alliance, which we offered them, and the fortune of war to which they thus chose to appeal has decided against them. They have now fallen into our hands and are wholly at our mercy. We do not, however, mean to do them any harm. We spare and forgive them for your sakes. We intend to invite them to come and live with us and with you at Rome, so that you can once more experience the happiness of being joined to your fathers and brothers, as well as your husbands. We shall not destroy or even injure their cities, but shall send some of our own citizens to people them, so that they may become fully incorporated into the Roman commonwealth. Thus your fathers and brothers and all your countrymen receive the boon of life, liberty, and happiness through you. And all that we ask of you in return is that you will continue your conjugal affection and fidelity to your Roman husbands, and seek to promote the harmony and happiness of the city by every means in your power. Of course, such transactions as these attracted great attention throughout the country, and both the valor with which Romulus encountered his enemies while they resisted and opposed him, and the generosity with which he admitted them to an honorable alliance with him when they were reduced to submission, were universally applauded. In fact, there began to be formed a strong public sentiment in favor of the new colony, and the influx to it of individual adventurers from all parts of the country rapidly increased. In one instance, a famous chieftain named Celius, a general of the Etrurians who lived north of the Tiber, brought over the whole army under his command in a body to join the new colony. New and special arrangements were necessary to be made at Rome for receiving so sudden and so large an accession to the numbers of the people, and accordingly a new eminence, one which had been hitherto without the city, was now enclosed and brought within the Pumerium. This hill received the name Celius from the general whose army occupied it. The city was extended, too, at the same time on the other side toward the Tiber. The walls were continued down to the very bank of the river, and thence carried along the bank so as to present a continued defense on that side, except at one place where there was a great gate leading to the water. During all this time, however, the Sabines still cherished the spirit of resentment and hostility, and instead of being conciliated by the forbearance and generosity of the Romans, were only excited to greater jealousy and ill will. At witnessing the proofs of their increasing influence and power, they employed themselves in maturing their plans for a grand onset against the new colony, and with the intention to make the blow which they were about to strike effectual and final, they took time to arrange their preparations on the most extensive scale, and to mature them in the most deliberate and thorough manner. They enlisted troops, they collected stores of provisions and munitions of war, they formed alliances with such states lying beyond them as they could draw into their quarrel, and finally, when all things were ready, they assembled their forces upon the frontier and prepared for the onset. The name of the general who was placed in command of this mighty host was Titus Tatius. In the meantime, Romulus and the people of the city were equally busy in making preparations for defense. They procured and laid up in magazines great stores of provisions for the use of the city. They strengthened and extended the walls, and built new ramparts and towers wherever they were needed. Numitor rendered very essential aid to his grandson in these preparations. He sent supplies of weapons to him for the use of the men, and furnished various military engines, such as were used in those times in the attack and defense of besieged cities. In fact, the preparations on both sides were of the most extensive character, and seemed to portend a very resolute and determined contest. When all things were thus ready, the Sabines, before actually striking the blow for which they had been so long and so deliberately preparing, concluded to send one more final embassy to Romulus to demand the surrender of the women. This was, of course, only a matter of form, as they must have known well from what had already passed that Romulus would not now yield to such a proposal. He did not yield. He sent back word, in answer to their demand, that the Sabine women were all well settled in Rome, and were contented and happy there with their husbands and friends, and that he could not think now of disturbing them. This answer having been received, the Sabines prepared for the onset. There was a certain tract of country surrounding Rome which belonged to the people of the city, and was cultivated by them. This land was used partly for tillage and partly for pasturage of cattle, but principally for the latter, as the rearing of flocks and herds was for various reasons a more advantageous mode of procuring food for man in those ancient days than the culture of the ground. The rural population, therefore, of the Roman territory consisted chiefly of herdsmen, and when the approaching danger from the Sabines became imminent, Romulus called all these herdsmen in, and required the flocks of sheep and herds of cattle to be driven to the rear of the city and shut up in an enclosure there, where they could be more easily defended. Thus the Sabine army found, when they were ready to cross the frontier, that the Roman territory on that side was deserted and solitary, and that there was nothing to oppose them in advancing across it almost to the very gates of Rome. They advanced accordingly, and when they came near to the city, they found that Romulus had taken possession of 2 hills without the walls, where he had entrenched himself in great force. These 2 hills were named Esquiline and Quirinial hills. The city itself included 2 other hills, namely the Palatine and the Capitoline. The Capitoline hill was the one on which the asylum had formerly been built, and it was now the citadel. The citadel was surrounded on all parts with ramparts and towers, which overlooked and commanded all the neighboring country. The command of this fortress was given to Tarpeius, the noble Roman. He had a daughter named Tarpeia, whose name afterward became greatly celebrated in history on account of the part which she took in the events of this siege, as will presently appear. At the foot of the Capitoline hill, and on the western side of it, that is, the side away from the city, there was a spacious plain, which was afterward included within the limits of the city, and used as a parade ground under the name of Campus Martius, which words mean the war field. This field was now, however, an open plain, and the Sabine army advancing to it encamped upon it. The Sabine forces were much more numerous than those of the Romans, but the latter were so well guarded and protected by their walls and fortifications that Titus Tatius saw no feasible way of attacking them with any prospect of success. At last, one day, as some of his officers were walking around the Capitoline hill, looking at the walls of the citadel, Tarpeia came to one of the gates, which was in a retired and solitary position, and entered into a parley with the men. The story of what followed is variously related by different historians, and it is now difficult to ascertain the actual truth respecting it. The account generally received is this: promising the bracelets. Tarpeia had observed the soldiers from the walls, and her attention had been attracted by the bracelets and rings which they wore, and she finally made an agreement with the Sabines that she would open the postern gate in the night and let them in if they would give her what they wore upon their arms, meaning the ornaments which had attracted her attention. The Sabines bound themselves to do this, and then went away. Titus Tatius, accordingly, when informed of this arrangement, detailed a strong detachment of troops, and gave them orders to repair at night in a very silent and secret manner to the gate, which had been designated as the place where they were to be let in. It is asserted, however, by some writers that this apparent treachery on the part of Tarpeia was only a deep-laid stratagem on her part to draw the Sabines into a snare, and that she sent word to Romulus informing him of the agreement which she had made, in order that he might secretly dispatch a strong force to take their position at the gate, and intercept and capture the Sabine party as soon as they should come in. But if this was Tarpeia's design, it totally failed. The Sabines, when they came at midnight to the postern gate which Tarpeia opened for them, came in sufficient force to bear down all opposition, and in fulfillment of their promise to give Tarpeia what they wore upon their arms, they threw their heavy bucklers upon her until she was crushed down beneath the weight of them and killed. A steep rock which forms that side of the Capitoline Hill is called the Tarpeian Rock, in memory of this maiden to the present day. In this way the Sabines gained possession of the citadel. Though Romulus still held the main city, the Romans were of course extremely disconcerted at the loss of the citadel, and Romulus, finding that the danger was now extremely imminent, resolved no longer to stand on the defensive, but to come out upon the plain and offer the Sabines battle. He accordingly brought his forces out of the city and took up a strong position with them between the Capitoline and the Palatine hills, with his front toward the Campus Martius, where the main body of the Sabines were posted. Thus the armies were confronted against each other on the plain, the Romans holding the city and the Palatine Hill as a stronghold to retreat to in case of necessity, while the Sabines in the same manner could seek refuge on the Capitoline Hill and the citadel. Things being in this state, a series of desperate but partial contests ensued, which were continued for several days, when at length a general battle came on. During all this time the walls of the city and of the citadel were lined with spectators who had ascended to witness the combats, for from these walls and from the declivities of the hills the whole plain could be looked down upon as if it were a map. The battle continued all day. At night both parties were exhausted, and the field was covered with the dead and dying, but neither side had gained a victory. The next day, by common consent, they suspended the battle, in order to take care of the wounded and to bury the bodies of the dead. After the interval of a day, which was spent on both sides in removing the horrid relics of the previous combats, and in gathering fresh strength and fresh desperation and rage for the conflicts yet to come, the struggle was renewed. The soldiers fought now on this renewal of the battle with more dreadful and deadly ferocity than ever. Various incidents occurred during the day to give one party or the other a local or temporary advantage, but neither side wholly prevailed. At one point Romulus himself was exposed to the most imminent personal danger, and for a time it was thought that he was actually killed. The Romans had gained some great advantage over a party of the Sabines, and the latter were rushing in a headlong flight to the citadel, the Romans pursuing them and hoping to follow them in the confusion and thus regain possession of the fortress. To prevent this, the Sabines within the citadel and on the rocks above threw stones down upon the Romans. One of these stones struck Romulus on the head, and he fell down, stunned and senseless under the blow. His men were extremely terrified at this disaster, and abandoning the pursuit of their enemies, they took up the body of Romulus and carried it into the city. It was found, however, that he was not seriously injured. He soon recovered from the effects of the blow and returned into the battle. Another incident which occurred in the course of these battles has been commemorated in history by having been the means of giving a name to a small lake or pool which was afterward brought into the limits of the city. A Sabine general named Curtius happened at one time to encounter Romulus in a certain part of the field, and a long and desperate combat ensued between the two champions. Other soldiers gradually came up and mingled in the fray, until at length Curtius, finding himself wounded and bleeding, and surrounded by enemies, fled for his life. Romulus pursued him for a short distance, but Curtius at length came suddenly upon a small swampy pool, which was formed of water that had been left by the inundations of the river in some old deserted channel, and which was now covered and almost concealed by some sort of mossy and floating vegetation. Curtius, running headlong and paying little heed to his steps, fell into this hole and sank in the water. Romulus supposed, of course, that he would be drowned there, and so turned away and went to find some other enemy. Curtius, however, succeeded in crawling out of the pond into which he had fallen, and in commemoration of the incident the pond was named Lake Curtius, which name it retained for centuries afterward, when not only had all the water disappeared, but the place itself had been filled up and had been covered with streets and houses. The combats between the Romans and the Sabines were continued for several days, during all which time the Sabine women, on whose account it was that this dreadful quarrel had arisen, were suffering the greatest anxiety and distress. They loved their fathers and brothers, but then they loved their husbands too, and they were overwhelmed with anguish at the thought that day after day those who were equally dear to them were engaged in fighting and destroying one another, and that they could do nothing to arrest so unnatural a hostility. At length, however, after suffering extreme distress for many days, a crisis arrived when they found that they could interpose. Both parties had become somewhat weary of the contest. Neither could prevail over the other, and yet neither was willing to yield. The Sabines could not bring themselves to submit to so humiliating an alternative as to withdraw from Rome and leave their daughters and sisters in the captors' hands, after all the grand preparations which they had made for retaking them. And, on the other hand, the Romans could not take those who, whatever had been their previous history, were now living happily as wives and mothers, each in her own house in the city, and give them up to an army of invaders, demanding them with threats and violence, without deep dishonor. Thus, though there was a pause in the conflict, and both parties were weary of it, Neither was willing to yield, and both were preparing to return to the struggle with new determination and vigor. The Sabine women thought that they might now interpose. A lady named Hersilia, who is often mentioned as one of the most prominent among the number, proposed this measure and made arrangements for carrying it into effect. She assembled her countrywomen and explained to them her plan, which was that they should go in a body to the Roman Senate and ask permission to intercede between the contending nations and plead for peace. The company of women, taking their children with them, all of whom were yet very young, went accordingly in a body to the Senate chamber and asked to be admitted. The doors were opened to them, and they went in. They all appeared to be in great distress and agitation. The grief and anxiety which they had suffered during the progress of the war still continued, and they begged the Senate to let them go out to the camp of the Sabines and endeavor to persuade them to make peace. The Senate was disposed to consent. The women wished to take their children with them, but some of the Romans imagined that there might perhaps be danger, that under pretense of interceding for peace, they were really intending to make their escape from Rome altogether. So it was insisted that they should leave their children behind them as hostages for their return, excepting that such as had two children were allowed to take one, which plan it was thought would aid them in moving the compassion of their Sabine relatives. The women accordingly left the Senate chamber, and with their children in their arms, their hair dishevelled, their robes disordered, and their countenances wan with grief, went in mournful procession out through the gate of the city. They passed across the plain and advanced toward the citadel. They were admitted, and after some delay were ushered into the council of the Sabines. Here their tears and exclamations of grief broke forth anew. When silence was in some measure restored, Hersilia addressed the Sabine chieftains, saying that she and her companions had come to beg their countrymen to put an end to the war. "We know," said she, "that you are waging it on our account, and we see in all that you have done proofs of your love for us. In fact, it was our supposed interest which led you to commence it. But now our real interests require that it should be ended. It is true that when we were first seized by the Romans, we felt greatly wronged, but having submitted to our fate, we have now become settled in our new homes and are contented and happy in them. We love our husbands and love our children, and we are treated with the utmost kindness and respect by all. Do not then, under a mistaken kindness for us, attempt to tear us away again, or continue this dreadful war, which, though ostensibly on our account and for our benefit, is really making us inexpressibly miserable." This intercession produced the effect which might have been expected from it. The Sabines and Romans immediately entered upon negotiations for peace, and peace is easily made where both parties are honestly desirous of making it. In fact, a great reaction took place, so that from the reckless and desperate hostility which the two nations had felt for each other, there succeeded so friendly a sentiment that in the end a treaty of union was made between the two nations. It was agreed that the two nations should be merged into one. The Sabine territory was to be annexed to that of Rome, and Titius Tatius, with the principal Sabine chieftains, were to remove to Rome, which was thenceforth to be the capital of the new kingdom. In a word, never was a reconciliation between two belligerent nations so sudden and so complete. End of chapter 12. Reading by Simon Wainwright.
Chapter 13 of Romulus. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Romulus by Jacob Abbott. Chapter 13. The Conclusion. BC 764 to 717. After the termination of the Sabine War, Romulus continued to reign many years, and his reign, although no very exact and systematic history of it was recorded at the time, seems to have presented the usual variety of incidents and vicissitudes. And yet, notwithstanding occasional and partial reverses, the city and the kingdom connected with it made rapid progress in wealth and population. For 4 or 5 years after the union of the Sabines with the Romans, Titus Tatius was in some way or other associated with Romulus in the government of the United Kingdom. Romulus, during all this time, had his house and his court on the Palatine Hill, where the city had been originally built, and where most of the Romans lived. The headquarters of the Sabine chieftain were, on the other hand, upon the Capitoline Hill, which was the place on which the citadel was situated that his troops had taken possession of in the course of the war, and which it seems they continued to occupy after the peace. The space between the two hills was set apart as a market-place, or forum, as it was called in their language, that place being designated for the purpose on account of its central and convenient situation. When afterward that portion of the city became filled, as it did, with magnificent streets and imposing architectural edifices, the space which Romulus had set apart for a market remained an open public square, and, as it was the scene in which transpired some of the most remarkable events connected with Roman history, it became renowned throughout the world under the name of the Roman Forum. In consequence of the union of the Romans and the Sabines, and of the rapid growth of the city in population and power which followed, the Roman state began soon to rise to so high a position in relation to the surrounding cities and kingdoms as soon to take precedence of them altogether. This was owing, however, in part undoubtedly to the character of the men who governed at Rome. The measures which they adopted in founding the city and in sustaining it through the first years of its existence, as described in the foregoing chapters, were all of a very extraordinary character, and evinced very extraordinary qualities in the men who devised them. These measures were bold, comprehensive, and sagacious, and they were carried out with a certain combination of courage and magnanimity which always gives to those who possess it and who are in a position to exercise it on a commanding scale great ascendancy over the minds of men. They who possess these qualities generally feel their power, and are usually not slow to assert it. A singular and striking instance of this occurred not many years after the peace with the Sabines. There was a city at some distance from Rome, called Cameria, whose inhabitants were a lawless horde, and occasionally parties of them made incursions, as was said, into the surrounding countries, for plunder. The Roman Senate sent word to the government of the city that such accusations were made against them, and very coolly cited them to appear at Rome for trial. The Camerians, of course, refused to come. The Senate then declared war against them, and sent an army to take possession of the city, proceeding to act in the case precisely as if the Roman government constituted a judicial tribunal, having authority to exercise jurisdiction and to enforce law and order among all the nations around them. In fact, Rome continued to assert and to maintain this authority over a wider and wider circle every year, until in the course of some centuries after Romulus's day she made herself the arbiter of the world. Titus Tatius shared the supreme power with Romulus at Rome for several years, and the two monarchs continued during this time to exercise their joint power in a much more harmonious manner than would have been supposed possible. At length, however, causes of disagreement began to occur, and in the end open dissension took place, in the course of which Tatius came to his end in a very sudden and remarkable manner. A party of soldiers from Rome, it seems, had been committing some deed of violence at Lavinium, the ancient city which Aeneas had built when he first arrived in Latium. The people of Lavinium complained to Romulus against these marauders. It happened, however, that the guilty men were chiefly Sabines, and in the discussions which took place at Rome afterward in relation to the affair, Tatius took their part, and endeavoured to shield them, while Romulus seemed disposed to give them up to the Lavinians for punishment. "They are robbers and murderers," said Romulus, "and we ought not to shield them from the penalty due to their crimes." "They are Roman citizens," said Tatius, "and we must not give them up to a foreign state." The controversy became warm, parties were formed, and at last the exasperation became so great that, when the Lavinian envoys, who had come to Rome to demand the punishment of the robbers, were returning home, a gang of Tatius' men intercepted them on the way and killed them. This of course increased the excitement and the difficulty in a tenfold degree. Romulus immediately sent to Lavinium to express his deep regret at what had occurred, and his readiness to do everything in his power to expiate the offence which his countrymen had committed. He would arrest these murderers, he said, and send them to Lavinium, and he would come himself with Tatius to Lavinium, and there make an expiatory offering to the gods, in attestation of the abhorrence which they both felt for so atrocious a crime as waylaying and murdering the ambassadors of a friendly city. Tatius was compelled to assent to these measures, though he yielded very reluctantly. He could not openly defend such a deed as the murder of the envoys, and so he consented to accompany Romulus to Lavinium to make the offering, but he secretly arranged a plan for rescuing the murderers from the Lavinians after they had been given up. Accordingly, while he and Romulus were at Lavinium offering the sacrifices, news came that the murderers of the envoys, on their way from Rome to Lavinium, had been rescued and allowed to escape. This news so exasperated the people of Lavinium against Tatius, for they considered him as unquestionably the secret author and contriver of the deed, that they rose upon him at the festival, and murdered him with the butcher knives and spits which had been used for slaughtering and roasting the animals. They then formed a grand procession, and escorted Romulus out of the city in safety, with loud acclamations. The government of Lavinium, as soon as the excitement of the scene was over, fearing the resentment which they very naturally supposed Romulus would feel at the murder of his colleague, seized the ringleaders of the riot, and sent them bound to Rome, to place them at the disposal of the Roman government. Romulus sent them back unharmed, directing them to say to the Lavinian government that he considered the death of Tatius, though inflicted in a mode lawless and unjustifiable, as nevertheless in itself only a just expiation for the murder of the Lavinian ambassadors, which Tatius had instigated or authorized. The Sabines of Rome were for a time greatly exasperated at these occurrences, but Romulus succeeded in gradually quieting and calming them, and they finally acquiesced in his decision. Romulus thus became once more the sole and undisputed master of Rome. After this, the progress of the city in wealth and prosperity from year to year was steady and sure, interrupted, it is true, by occasional and temporary reverses, but with no real retrocession at any time. Causes of disagreement arose from time to time with neighboring states, and in such cases Romulus always first sent a summons to the party implicated, whether king or people, citing them to appear and answer for their conduct before the Roman Senate. If they refused to come, he sent an armed force against them, as if he were simply enforcing the jurisdiction of a tribunal of justice. The result usually was that the refractory state was compelled to submit, and its territories were added to those of the kingdom of Rome. Thus the boundaries of the new empire were widening and extending every year. Romulus paid great attention in the meantime to everything pertaining to the internal organization of the state, so as to bring every part of the national administration into the best possible condition. The municipal police, the tribunals of justice, the social institutions and laws of the industrial classes, the discipline of the troops, the enlargement and increase of the fortifications of the city, and the supply of arms and stores and munitions of war, and every other subject, in fact, connected with the welfare and prosperity of the city, occupied his thoughts in every interval of peace and tranquillity. In consequence of the exertions which he made, and the measures which he adopted, order and system prevailed more and more in every department, and the community became every year better organized and more consolidated, so that the capacity of the city to receive accessions to the population increased even faster than accessions were made. In a word, the solid foundations were laid of that vast superstructure which, in subsequent ages, became the wonder of the world. Notwithstanding, however, all this increasing greatness and prosperity, Romulus was not without rivals and enemies, even among his own people at Rome. The leading senators became at last envious and jealous of his power. They said that he himself grew imperious and domineering in spirit as he grew older, and manifested a pride and haughtiness of demeanour which excited their ill will. He assumed too much authority, they said, in the management of public affairs, as if he were an absolute and despotic sovereign. He wore a purple robe on public occasions as a badge of royalty. He organized a body-guard of 300 young troopers, who rode before him whenever he moved about the city, and in all respects assumed such pomp and parade in his demeanour, and exercised such a degree of arbitrary power in his acts, as made him many enemies. The whole Senate became, at length, greatly disaffected. At last, one day, on occasion of a great review which took place at a little distance from the city, there came up a sudden shower, attended with thunder and lightning, and the violence of the tempest was such as to compel the soldiers to retire precipitately from the ground in search of some place of shelter. Romulus was left with a number of senators, who were at that time attending upon him, alone, on the shore of a little lake which was near the place that had been chosen for the parade. After a short time, the senators themselves came away from the ground and returned to the city, but Romulus was not with them. The story which they told was that in the middle of the tempest Romulus had been suddenly enveloped in a flame, which seemed to come down in a bright flash of lightning from the clouds, and immediately afterward had been taken up in the flame to heaven. This strange story was but half believed, even at first, by the people, and very soon rumours began to circulate in the city that Romulus had been murdered by the senators who were around him at the time of the shower, they having seized the occasion afforded by the momentary absence of his guards and by their solitary position. There were various surmises in respect to the disposal which the assassins had made of the body. The most obvious supposition was that it had been sunk in the lake. There was, however, a horrible report circulated that the senators had disposed of it by cutting it up into small pieces and conveying it away, each taking a portion under their robes. Of course, these rumours produced great agitation and excitement throughout the city. The current of public sentiment set strongly against the senators. Still, as nothing could be positively ascertained in respect to the transaction, the mystery seemed to grow more dark and dreadful every day, and the public mind was becoming more and more deeply agitated. At length, however, the mystery was suddenly explained by a revelation, which, whatever may be thought of it at the present day, was then entirely satisfactory to the whole community. One of the most prominent and distinguished of the senators, named Proclus, one who, it seems, had not been present among the other senators in attendance upon Romulus at the time when he disappeared, came forward one day before a grand assembly which had been convened for the purpose, and announced to them, in the most solemn manner, that the spirit of Romulus had appeared to him in a visible form, and had assured him that the story which the other senators had told of the ascension of their chieftain to heaven in a flame of fire was really true. "I was journeying," said Proclus, "in a solitary place, when Romulus appeared to me. At first I was exceedingly terrified. The form of the vision was taller than that of a mortal man, and it was clothed in armour of the most resplendent brightness. As soon as I had in some measure recovered my composure, I spoke to it. 'Why,' said I, 'have you left us so suddenly? And especially, why did you leave us at such a time and in such a way as to bring suspicion and reproach on the Roman senators?' 'I left you,' said he, 'because it pleased the gods to call me back again to heaven, whence I originally came. It was no longer necessary for me to remain on earth, for Rome is now established, and her future greatness and glory are sure. Go back to Rome and communicate this to the people. Tell them that if they continue industrious, virtuous, and brave, the time will come when their city will be the mistress of the world, and that I, no longer its king, am henceforth to be its tutelar divinity.' The people of Rome were overjoyed to hear this communication. Their doubts and suspicions were now all removed. The senators at once recovered their good standing in the public regard, and all was once more peace and harmony. Altars were immediately erected to Romulus, and the whole population of the city joined in making sacrifices and in paying other divine honours to his memory. The declaration of Proclus that he had seen the spirit of Romulus, and his report of the conversation which the spirit had addressed to him, constituted proof of the highest kind, according to the ideas which prevailed in those ancient days. In modern times, however, there is no faith in such a story, and the truth in respect to the end of Romulus can now never be known. After the death of Romulus, the senators undertook to govern the state themselves, holding the supreme power one by one in regular rotation. This plan was, however, not found to succeed, and after an interregnum of about a year, the people elected another king. The End. End of chapter 13. End of Romulus by Jacob Abbott.